Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 94 of the Simpa Life Podcast. I don't know if you've noticed, if you've looked out your window, but it looks like summer's over. I know astrologically it's not for another couple of weeks, but very much is in the north. So we're going to be inside. So I'm going to give you some wonderful content to keep your ears and eyes amused for the next hour or so. Probably two, because there's quite a hell of a lot of content to cover here. Today's guest, I'm not even going to bother segueing, we can just jump straight into it, is currently a non-practicing, this is a weird way my notes have written this, I'll try that again. Today's guest is a non-practicing British lawyer who, after having a legal epiphany when working with renowned psychedelic chemist Casey William Hardison, went on to found the Drug Equality Alliance, the DEA, love that acronym, brilliant, a non-profit whose purpose is to transform the war on some people who use drugs from its... God, my notes there are really bad. From its subject, historical and cultural roots into a rational and objective legal regulatory framework. They are Darryl Bickler. How are you doing, brother?
I'm all right. You certainly set yourself up with a mouthful with that introduction. But thanks. I'm so pleased to be here, Simpa. I mean, yeah, we first met, was it about 2 weeks ago now, or was it a bit longer? Product Earth.
I think physically in presence, yeah. A couple of weeks ago, Product Earth, but I've been quite aware of you for a long time, and it's just that kind of synchronicity of the universe. I think the timing of it was perfect for us to meet a few weeks ago.
Perfect. Yeah, timing is everything. It's always now. So there's no point in beating ourselves up about past failures. So we'll have a brief resume of how we got to this point. But like we say, onwards and upwards.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's going onwards anyway. I'd much rather prefer to go up, but saying that, going down is pretty fun if you think of a roller coaster, folks. I suppose then a lot of people are going to be like, Darryl Bickler? I've never heard of this guy. What's this guy done? So I suppose for my audience that don't know, and I suppose actually to fill in some of the blanks of the information that I don't know, could you possibly give us sort of a brief synopsis, summation bio, I guess, of your sort of work?
Sure. Well, I was kind of a mature student in law. I retrained. I was getting a bit ill. I used to be in hotels and catering, and I decided to retrain in law. I found it fascinating. And I managed to get myself a training contract eventually. It was all quite difficult in criminal law. And really, I find that enjoying. I mean, just going to police stations in the middle of the night. I mean, a lot of people hate it, but I found it almost a sport, really, playing that game. And I realized that I was so much on the side of defendants, even though people say, well, how can you represent all these people, drug users, and much worse people? But I always felt that there was inequality in the equation with the individual and the state, and that it was a very rough ride when you see people less fortunate than ourselves, caught up with the police. And it's incredible, the disruption to people's lives that you're aware of. They're locked in a cell. I used to go to the police station, and I would immediately demand to see my client. I would look at the custody record, check that they've had drinks, they've had breaks, they've been allowed out for a smoke, make sure that everything was right, because I always felt that this person was in a much worse predicament than myself. Mm-hmm. And I would always go the extra mile, if I say so myself, just to get the best defense I could. Mm-hmm. But I realized quite early on that what I could do was quite limited. I had some young clients that were locked up in a young offenders institution, but one or two of them quite vulnerable people, charged with very small scale dealing of heroin, which was pretty typical in Bradford, people selling wraps to fund their own habit. Mm. And I felt sorry that when counsel told me that the minimum sentence likely for these young lads was going to be 6 years. And the one that I was charged with looking at was quite vulnerable, and I decided to apply to the Legal Aid Board for extra funding to get a psychological report and a psychiatric report to use in mitigation. And these things cost thousands of pounds. You have to appeal to the Legal Aid Board. It's all solicitors' work, and sometimes you have to get legal aid funding from another area to contest the decision of the legal aid board in your area. So legal aid is double funding at this point. Such a crazy system. Well, anyway, I managed to get funding, and I had expert reports, and these things cost a couple of grand each at least at that time, probably more like 5. And they identified that my client was, in a vulnerable category, broken home, poor schooling, no role models, all these kind of things, and with personality difficulties. And I presented all this to the court for sentencing. And I read the judge said in court, and I have to say to the instructing solicitor, Mr. Bickler, I fundamentally take issue with you presenting this evidence. Drugs are a cancer in this society. And effectively was saying that my client was a cancer. Yeah. And, I've spent equivalent to probably 10 grand just on those reports, plus the probably 30,000, 40,000 pounds in overall cost of the defence. Not that I'm getting that money, by the way, I was just employed. Mm-hmm. But to say that, after all of that work, and bang that guy up in a place where he's probably going to come to harm and pick up even worse behaviour and tricks, it's I just thought, this is pointless. Mm. And I was really thinking about giving up. And one night, it was literally the middle of the night. I got a call. I thought it must be a crank call because I wasn't on the rota for the police station at that point, where they can call you anytime. Mm. And it was an American citizen, I think you mentioned in the intro, called Casey Hardison. Now, I had read about him, but I thought this was a bit of a wind-up. It must be some pal. But as the conversation progressed, I realised that this was real, and I couldn't understand how he was calling me from a prison cell because, generally they really do screen prisoners for mobile phones nowadays. It is pretty difficult. I know everybody imagines prisoners get phones, but in a high security prison, this guy was serving 20 years. It's quite difficult. And that's why I didn't really believe it. But as the conversation developed, he explained that he had got a cell phone in tiny, he'd broken it down into little components, and he inserted these into condoms and inserted these into himself. And he'd hacked into some Swiss network somehow, and he had free calls all night. And this ultimately led to him calling me nearly every night to talk about what was happening to him. Mm-hmm. And for people that don't know, which is probably most people won't know about Casey either, but though he's famous in the psychedelic field because he invented new ways to make psychedelics. And he was known as the Wizard because he set up the biggest lab, the most sophisticated lab the police had ever seen in Brighton. Mm-hmm. And he was manufacturing substances that he felt were not substances of abuse. I mean, a lot of people will balk at the idea of somebody making Class A drugs, but I do agree that psychedelics are not generally drugs of abuse, or they certainly don't have to be. And he was making LSD, and he invented his own way of doing it, but normally you have to use quite a few listed precursors. It's quite a complicated synthesis. He made an even more complicated method. I think he referred to the PIBOP system, and he used a vacuum to be able to create this molecule more simply in terms of precursor agents than was previously possible. So he was making LSD. Now, when you make a run of LSD, it's not that you can just make for personal use or for yourself and your friends. I mean, once you're into a few grams of it, which is the minimum, you're talking about thousands of doses, literally thousands of doses. And so it wasn't that he was trying to be big in business, but he did have this idea that he was making something for the benefit of mankind. And he also made DMT, and he made NDMA as well, and I believe 2CB. I can't remember all the molecules they found in his lab. Mm-hmm. And I won't go into the details of the case. But he had read about me in a court judgment that previously I had been involved with a case of helping a friend who was importing psychoactive plants from South America. And listeners viewers may know a little bit about these things, or maybe they just prefer to stay with cannabis. But all these things exist out there in nature, fabulous possibilities in these plants. And this chap was importing vines to make ayahuasca, which is a shamanic brew, which contains DMT. And the DMT is in some leaves that you add to the vine. You have to boil it up. And then he was also importing cactus skins from South America. And those cacti, those green skins, they contain mescaline, which is also a Class A drug. But previously, nobody had ever thought of plants being part of the controlled substances legislation. In fact, they're not. You could buy plants that contain mescaline in home base and garden centres, actually, at the time. The plant that more people would be familiar with would be peyote. It's very similar to peyote, but it's a different cacti.
It's San Pedro.
San Pedro, exactly. And I think they call it wachuma there. And not a substance to be trifled with, by the way. My former wife was Peruvian, and I spent time out there. And I did try ayahuasca a few times, and San Pedro, which is possibly an 18-hour experience, not to be trifled with. But nevertheless, it's a learning experience. It's certainly a mind-opening experience. It's not a drug of abuse. Anyway, so I helped him. I wrote to the Home Office. I had been writing to the Home Office before this, saying that this idea that a plant becomes a controlled drug through the hand of man because it's being dried, and this makes it a preparation of a controlled drug, is entirely an illegitimate way of defining things. I mean, plants dry out quite naturally. You could buy a cactus, and after 5 years, if you didn't water it, it would become dried out. You can't then say now, just because you've left that cactus in your potting shed, you've now in possession of a Class A drug. But nevertheless, his imports were seized by Border Control, whatever agents they were doing this. And they said, right, you've got 10 kilograms of cactus here, and that's 10K of controlled drugs, Class A, thank you very much. So what happened was that my letters were brought, adduced as evidence in court. And the judge accepted that there was certainly uncertainty in the law, and that one thing that you are entitled to is reasonable clarity. You're not meant to sort of preempt what the law might find you guilty of. You know, you're entitled to know. And that degree of uncertainty was enough to acquit that gentleman of the very serious charges at Kingston Crown Court. And that was mentioned in the judgment. And Casey, in his prison cell, was a fantastic researcher. He had managed to access internet, a cell like a law library. He managed to get funding from external sources to buy law books. I was buying books. Some of the books were costing hundreds of pounds, which he was funding, by the way, not myself. But and he came across that judgment, and that's why he contacted me, because he thought, well, here's someone who's prepared to help. And so we got talking, and he, rather than usually for a criminal law client, was the one kind of leading the whole thing, whereas typically with the criminal law client, I would kind of walk in and have to tell them what the lie of the land is. This is what's possible. This is what is. This is the law. This is what isn't. And I was quite used to that. And it came as quite a sort of a bit of a sort of shaking of the egos and things like that when I had this guy in prison telling me what to do and what was what, which was exactly what was happening. Only rarely would I be able to actually help him. I felt like, in many ways, I was like his assistant. And I guess that was the inevitable consequence of coming across somebody who has a unique intellect, one of these guys who can sort of hack into systems and, you know, start a crisis from his little office somewhere just because he's so clever. These kind of people get recruited into CIA and other things. Pretty much a mastermind. And Casey, he sort of helped me get to grips with what was really happening, because I'd never really thought about it before, other than that this is wrong, this is unjust. I've had personal experiences with drugs. I started smoking cannabis when I went to college. That's like over 40 years now ago. I have to say, it seemed very different then. And I dabbled in, for experimental purposes, know what I'm talking about, with lots of things, like I said, being to South America. Mm-hmm. Tried their strongest drugs, or plant medicines, I should say. Don't call them drugs, people get upset. But it was really mind-opening to hear from Casey about how he understood words. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, everything, this we're having a conversation, is based upon words, and we're just talking like normal people at the moment. Mm-hmm. But Casey realized that the law isn't just a conversation. You can't really talk about it in quite the same way. Now, I don't want to jump ahead too much, because I know you probably have questions about that. And it's easy for me to go on a roll and just do the whole thing without you saying anything sometimes. So I'll just back off for a minute and let you come back then, Simpa.
I appreciate that. I was lost within the storytelling there. Brilliant. I think you've surmised really, really quite well how sort of you transitioned from, I guess, a former life to the current one that you're in. Sure. And you hit on some wonderful things that will come to as the natural progression of this recording goes. But one of the things I was struck by here is the way the system is kind of geared up. So you do all of this work for your client, to go back to the one of the vulnerable clients who was accused of and ultimately found guilty of dealing heroin. You then put in work for mitigation, which means that you then accept guilt under the law. So you are not fighting, disrespecting their terms, against the law. You've done everything according to the letter of it. You are a defense solicitor in that action. You are seeking to provide the best defense. To then be belittled and to disrespected by a judge, which in its guise is the manifestation, the representation of the law. What is going on there? How is that then not a conspiracy against the individual, the air quotes guilty party in this point, Well,
there's two things coming up there. One is this, which we will explore later because it's important, is this idea that the law is the law. When in fact, I tell you, when I first really thought about this was that there were people being hanged. I think Malaysia, which I'd also visited. I had friends in Malaysia, and I thought it was such a lovely experience to go there. People very gentle, wonderful environment in many ways. And then I was reading about these guys being hanged for cannabis. Mm-hmm. And I looked up the solicitors who were dealing with it, because I was already forearmed with a lot of possible defenses. Mm-hmm. And of course, most laws, including Singapore, they're loosely based upon the British law or the international kind of drugs laws. They're all kind of similar in many, many ways. But they would insist on hanging somebody if you had more than personal. Anything that looks like you're supplying, and it's hanging time, which something which kind of hits me very deep, really. I've thought of that. And that's remotely, if I was actually, that was my client, I think I would need counselling after that. I don't think I could handle that. But I did speak with solicitors by emails. And I said, well, I'm a UK lawyer. I'm dealing with all of these kind of issues already. Can I offer you any insights? And their attitude was, well, the law is the law. Don't make trouble. And I was saying, but that's our job. It's not that the law is the law. It's our job to look at how laws are being applied, how they are administered. And this is a crucial distinction that is the role of a serious lawyer. It's not to say, well, I just apply the law even though it seems unconscionable. Because if it seems unconscionable, there's probably something wrong. Because what laws really do, particularly the drugs laws, is they give powers to governments to administer, to keep them relevant, to keep them up to date, and to make sure that the way that they're functioning is proportional to the mischief that they're trying to prevent. So it's not like, you literally, hang people for dropping a piece of chewing gum. Okay, they don't like it in Singapore. Maybe they'll even get a cane out, a rotan, and hit you for doing it. Or maybe it's just a fine. But they don't hang you. So somebody would say, well, what's this chewing gum law? It's, is it proportionate to the mischief of the menace of chewing gum sticking to people's shoes in the street? Keep it relevant. Okay, so you make a legislation saying it's illegal to stop chewing gum in the street, or even to have chewing gum now in the city. But you always have to keep it up to date so that you don't just run away with it. And this is what drug laws do, is they afford a lot of power to ministers and to advisory bodies as well. In our case, in Britain, we've got an advisory council, and they are supposed to be administering the law. And then what they do is what they call delegated or secondary legislation, is they make new rules within the existing law. So the law isn't really the law. Yes, the primary law is the law, though even that law can be challenged ultimately on human rights grounds. It may not be constitutional. Those types of challenges are quite difficult in Britain because Parliament is supreme, it's sovereign. And if they pass a law, they pass it. But secondary law, all of this administration law that the ministers do, that's bread and butter work for judicial review. This is the kind of thing that people go and say, well, your environmental policy, it's not protecting the planet. We're going to judicially review it to stop fracking or to stop whatever cause that you might think isn't right. You can challenge the law. That's what it's about. And when I spoke to those solicitors, or wrote to those solicitors rather, in Malaysia, their culture was just that was disrespectful. That, to respect the judge, you would never say anything like that. That's a naughty boy. You're a naughty kind of lawyer thinking this. We're the good lawyers. We just apply the law as we get it. And I realized that was a cultural thing. And it's a cultural thing that is ubiquitous and permeates the minds of professionals worldwide, is that I'm only doing my job. I'm only following orders. It's as bad as that, because people will not think for themselves and they will not apply their moral judgment. And this is partly what everything I'm going to talk about the law today about, getting back to how it operates properly. It respects the individual. You have to respect the individual. And a judge who just follows orders. I mean, what kind of judge is that? Surely the point of having all that legal education, to be a judge, you have to be a lawyer, a solicitor, a barrister, generally a barrister, to be a senior judge. And you go through all of those years of training, all of that ongoing professional development. You have all of your experience day to day, 5 days a week, looking at cases. Then you are the person who knows what's right and wrong. It's not that you have to, but you still have to follow somebody else's rules just for consistency. Yeah. Judges are working more like, you could replace most judges with a computer program. Just with an algorithm. Just stick an algorithm. When did he plead guilty? Aggravating features, mitigating features, all of these little things, all affect sentencing. There's your answer, 22 weeks in prison, Yeah. And then you do it. That's not really being a professional in that regard. But professionalism has become following guidance. That's what it means to be professional. Just follow the rules, even though those rules, obviously, in certain cases, are entirely ridiculous. And so that I forgot the original question, but that was half the answer I was going to give about the judges. Yeah.
Well, I think that you spot on there. You answered the question in the way that, yes, I guess then it is a conspiracy in that they are conspiring to not be curious of the law. They are not trying to use their education and their skill set to best advantage the individual that they are working with. You know, we see this in contract law. We see this in accountancy and other aspects of law that involve, well, yeah, often a much larger payoff and incentive for the individual. But it's in their job type. They're a judge. They are there to pass judgment. Yeah. So yes, they are empowered and endowed with the wig and all the pageantry. That's the state giving them that power. But it is still an individual's brain, a human that is supposed to pass judgment within that interpretive sphere of the law. The law is, I would argue, designed to be interpretive, so it allows classism, it allows racism. But obviously, it's almost ambiguous enough that if you've got the right money, you can defend anything in any situation, as we've very well seen with some unbelievable court cases that have occurred in the world in the past, well, in my lifetime alone.
Well, I've never dealt with those kind of people that pull strings at that level, but I have been aware of some weird things happening in the opposite direction to make it impossible to get justice. I can tell you that much. One particular thing happened that I was talking before about judicial review, which is basically what we're doing here with cases work, because what we're doing is we're turning up and I remember now, because you were saying you're a defense solicitor, you're respecting the law, you're doing what you're supposed to. And part of that is to question whether the law is being applied properly, whether it's consistent with human rights and common law principles, which is exactly what we were doing. And so you go to judicial review, the administrative court, and you can look at the actions of government and authorities and question that. And that's what we try to do. But it annoys them in the criminal court when you stop the proceedings at the beginning. You could stop it at the magistrate's court and say, I'm going to judicially review this process because I don't believe. It's not that what Casey was saying, it's not that we're pleading guilty and we're trying to get mitigation. That wasn't what it was about at all. He's saying, and we were saying, that there's a problem within the administration of the law that makes the whole thing unjust from the start. We can't plead guilty or not guilty to this offence because the law that gives rise to these charges is not being applied or administered properly according to itself. So when you look at the Misuse of Drugs Act and what it sets out to do, and then you look at the way that the Home Office, subsequent Home Offices have administered it, has to keep it up to date, they failed to understand actually what the Misuse of Drugs Act is about, and therefore they're not doing it properly, and therefore I shouldn't be in the dock in the first place. Mm-hmm. So what we do is we go straight to the High Court and say there's a problem here that we shouldn't actually, we want you to look at the way that the Home Office has either provided secondary delegated legislation about these drugs or failed to do that because they have a duty to keep it up to date. So they can't just sit and do nothing. That's, they've got this job that literally is constant to make sure that everything is under review. And they failed to do that. So that's what our first appeal was about. So this is very different to mitigation. This is literally looking for a proper defence. Mm. And actually you can't plead guilty or not guilty at that point. I mean, if you had to plead, you'd say not guilty, but that's almost to imply that the charges are acceptable and you didn't do it. Whereas in fact you say, no, I did do this, but my real crime is that I didn't have a license to do this. Mm-hmm. And that the reason I didn't have a license is that you closed the door to the licensing operations, options that exist within the Misuse of Drugs Act. The Misuse of Drugs Act sets out all beautiful things to allow everybody to do sensible, important things with all drugs. Mm. It's all there, but they just kind of closed the door on it. And what's interesting is how they closed the door and how they stop you standing up for yourself. And this seems to be the pervasive theme that people walk with their heads down in this world, that in modern Britain, we're very subservient, really. We don't realize it. This is the thing, we don't realize it. We think everything is normal, but actually what defines our conscious existence in contemporary societies is so degraded that we think of ourselves as pawns in a system. I mean, I know people are ideologically opposed to it, but even opposing it, they don't quite realize the currency of it. They don't quite understand how to engage it, because what it means to be a human being nowadays isn't very much. You're not given very much rights, very much power, and you can't even take it. In fact, that what I just said alludes to a little bit what I'm saying. It's that people think about, oh, I should be given that. Give me these rights. And even that is passive, because it's almost like deferring to other people. I used to do some doorstep campaigning, political parties and things that I approved of. And I'd always have people saying, okay, it sounds interesting. So, what are you going to do about it to me? They say, I'm looking forward to you, sorting this out for me. Thanks very much. I'll think about voting. So the limit of their imagination about what could be done about a problem that we both shared, we both agree about, is that hopefully, if I can be bothered, as it were, hope doesn't really amount to very much, that I will go and do something for them, and they're prepared to tick a box for me. That's about the limit of most people's engagement nowadays. It's very degraded, and part of what this is about, what drugs are about, and what Understand the Law is about, is to try to rescue our subjectivity, rescue our agency from this quagmire of low horizons, of low expectations about what's possible. People just expect everything to be, oh yeah, gas price is going to go right up, food's going to be short, we're going to die. This is what, the way people are thinking. I went to Hyde Park Unity Day that's not Hyde Park in London, by the way. It wasn't so glamorous Hyde Park in Leeds. And I met so many students running political stalls, all with grandiose sounding names. And they just spoke about doom and gloom. They actually didn't think they would even live to anything like my age, because we'll all be dead. And there's this incredible negativity about humanity, and more importantly, about what each individual can do. Nobody believes they've got power to do anything. And I'll say even judges, they just feel like, oh yeah, I just apply, I just process things. Even when they get to the top, they're still stuck in this idea that what it means to be a human isn't very much at all. And I think that we're all the agents of humanity. All of us are equally valid. And everybody, we are the operating system. We experience it as individual, discrete organisms, even though we are all connected, both like through social means, and even if you believe in kind of a wider sort of panpsychic connectivity between people. But the operating system is to experience it as the self. And therefore, the rights of the self are fundamental. And what we've got at the moment is a system which actually tries to censor what you can be and who you can be, or how you are being. And drugs law is the perfect example of that, because firstly, laws just generally, they define us culturally. They define, your freedom of movement, who you can now, we've seen it all with the coronavirus debacle, how quickly they can close down all of your rights to even, mix with people. It's I found it quite strange that people were still campaigning about their cannabis social club ideas in the old way, even during the panic, even during when they said, well, actually, you can't even meet to have a book reading club. You can't, the Mind Cannabis Club. It fundamentally shows just how vulnerable we are that they could just abrogate all of those rights. So the law defines really your possibilities of physical being, but drugs law is something on another level, because drugs, and that includes practically everything. I mean, we can go right down to sugar and caffeine if you want to talk about drugs. And it is a tremendously misused word, because as soon as people hear the word drugs, they think we're talking about a certain type of substance. But of course, when you do that, when you give that away, that drugs are only certain drugs, then in a way you really let them off the hook for the way that the completely cynical way that they decide that people sort of walking down the middle of the road and completely drunk are not breaking any drugs law, but somebody sat in their house having a quiet joint is, because, you know, supposedly cannabis is a drug, and according to the general consensus, alcohol isn't even thought of as a drug. So we have to be careful about that word. That's the first word that requires care. Sorry, I just knocked that standard. So what drugs law does is that it defines us physiologically, because who we really are is a possibility of being permeable to all psychoactive molecules. So I won't make a distinction between synthetic molecules, because they are the products of human endeavor, and we are nature. But just to keep it simple, we'll talk about it as if they're all natural drugs. So there's these natural drugs like I talked about in South America. We all know about cannabinoids and the rest of it. We see them as things that are out there, but we are permeable to them through all different kinds of means. So we're permeable through our lungs, even through our skin, obviously through our digestive tracts, nasal membranes, the rest of it. We're permeable to these things. And when they do permeate into us, we've got receptors ready to act and receive them and welcome them. And even if we don't have specific receptors for certain drugs, they've certainly got particular physiological pathways which are already part of our system that engage those and then take you to some other kind of modality of being, some other way of thinking. And it is actually very much about free thoughts. I tend to see the mind in a way as an operating system that can be like upgraded or revamped by different chemicals, because we are chemical. That's what it is. Reality is this chemical structures that we exist with it, and we live. So we see ourselves as separate from other. Ultimately, it's all part of a continuum, and drugs are just part of that equation. And so what they're doing is by using words in a law where they literally have these lists. And when you look at the lists of the various so-called Class A, B, and C drugs, I mean, there are pages of these really long-sounding chemicals that you'd have to have a higher degree in organic chemistry or to even comprehend what those molecules represent. And they've sort of detailed almost all of them in every kind of isomer, and they've put them in a huge list. And what that's doing is saying that your consciousness, your way of thinking, has to be separated from nature with all of these different things. It's a bit like saying you can only travel to Spain, but all the other countries are off limits to you because we don't think they're appropriate. You might get bad ideas if you went to Africa. They literally have closed down what it means to be human. And it's not that you have to take every single substance or even be open to it. It's a possibility that I'm talking about. You exist as a possibility of everything from now. And so until you sort of pass on, you have this possibility. Now, you may or may not wish to try those South American plants or whatever. It's entirely, but to have it taken off the table and demonized, and then a partition put in front of you. It's literally, they've kind of slapped this protection, or I don't know if protection is the right word, because it's more of a censorship, a physiological, biochemical censorship over your experience of being. And that is something that I believe that we all have a right to. It's our legacy. That's what it means, to be the human, is the possibility of enjoying nature, of expanding consciousness. And if there are these technologies, to use sort of not quite the right word, but sort of like they do almost represent technologies that plants, it can be incorporated into shamanic structure. It could be incorporated into a therapeutic environment. It could be incorporated to recreational, spiritual means, is that they change what it means to have your ordinary waking consciousness to some degree. It might just be a little chill out from a few tokes on your favorite strain, right through to a complete out-of-body experience and a perception of the infinite and a sense of immortality. And I guess that's why people are finding substances like psilocybin from so-called magic mushrooms to be interesting, because in cases of terminal disease, people find it easier perhaps to come to terms with their apparent mortality because they obtain a sense of the infinite. And this is a very important sort of quasi-religious spiritual point that seems to be at the core of prohibition, is that the sort of the priestly class, as it were, want to control what it means to be spiritual, and that you should obey and do good work on earth and then you'll go to heaven. Mm-hmm. Whereas ultimately, people who have sort of crossed over the void into these shamanic routes will see things very differently, and they will see their role and their lives and their experience very differently. They will not just accept the ordinary waking consciousness as the only reality there is. And I think that's why they're clamping down. I'll just pipe down for a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just want to interject for a second. I immediately am struck by Jesus, I can't remember which North American tribe it was, so I'm not even going to try and butcher whichever name I'm trying to read in my head. But they had a concept of, you think forward in 7 generations, every action, every motion, everything has to incorporate what is this going to look like for the next 7 generations. In terms of the way that the tribes lived in symbiosis, with a synchronicity with nature, they understood these substances and the power of them, and the use was, in some ways shamanic and for medicinal and healing, and a lot of it was for curious exploration, to find other information to bring back to this physical plane and realm. And I think a lot of other sort of what became not even the monotheistic religions, but the old world religions that survived. I'm thinking of Hinduism, which is polytheistic, and Buddhism, which I guess is monotheistic. But they obviously taught things like breathwork, meditation, sound bathing, all these different things that were a way to also tap into that same sort of awareness and space. And I think we have this a line that stretches back across the entirety of human evolution and history. And if you believe Terence McKenna, obviously the stoned ape theory, that these have shaped the entirety of human evolution. I've just lost him. Damn it. Oh, bit of technical difficulty there, but looks like we're back. Bloody gremlins under the desk again. Every week. What was I saying about? 7 generations rather. So it's interesting that when we have had this affinity, this connection with all of these other potential conscious expanding experiences and compounds that, in a lot of ways, we are now starting to see, produce empathy, compassion, a sense of oneness and belonging with the entire world, a greater affinity and connection to nature, that in their absence, we've ended up with like the communist 5-year plan. And now we're in British politics, we don't even need a 4-year cycle for prime ministers and party leaders anymore. It's just we're regurgitating. There's no real substance to anything that we're seeing. And I think that you spoke of wonderfully of an analogy about sort of the restriction of color, and that we are in this world that I think so many people have forgotten what it is to live with the ability to express their conscious desires and unconscious desires freely. For all we've, regained civil rights for certain sectors of society, races and creeds and religious identities, and we're moving forward with, sexual rights and laws, we're still missing the fundamental ability, as you say, to just be human. So it's the two things that really strike out for me, is that we've lost this ability to plan and to look after everyone and have and hold the ideals of a larger society without these substances, or without these rituals, and the presence of shamans and the, I suppose, quasi spiritual leaders that we've had over the years. Not every one of those sort of
laudable new liberties and recognitions say about sexuality and things. It's really always as libertarian as you think, because there's always a flip side to it, whereby, let's say, freedom of expression. So, people start saying that they want to have, proper terms and recognize to the right language about their identity and not to be discriminated against, which is all well and good. But at the same time, then you need a law, supposedly, that says, well, you have now broken the law because you've said, oh, well, I only believe in two genders, male and female. I'm not going to get into that debate because it's not what I'm about. But, there are people for their religious or scientific purposes would say, I don't recognize that. I think it's like that. And that's my freedom of speech. But the law will say, well, actually, no, now you're guilty of harassment. Now you're guilty of some newfangled legislation. So we get more and more and more law. So this is what's happening, is that with every grant of a sort of a very well managed shift to accept something, then everything previously becomes unacceptable. So like when I was born, it would be illegal to be gay, which was obviously completely unconscionably evil thing to do, to say that. But now, if somebody for their Christian belief says, well, I don't think it's right, I think that, man should be with woman, then you're possibly already breaking the law. So we have to be careful about these very incremental liberties. Now, the example you just gave about what I said about color, I think that was from a previous conversation. Just now, in our podcast today, I was saying it's a bit like the British Society says, well, you're only allowed to go to Spain because we think that's a suitable place for your holiday. What I used that example before was to look at the idea of cannabis campaigning. And I said, imagine that there was some new law. This is purely out of my imagination. It's not meant to be realistic. But imagine there was a new law that said that artists and painters and decorators could only use black and white paints. They decided that everything has to be in these binary colors. And I'm kind of alluding to drugs law in saying that that's alcohol and tobacco, actually. That's the sort of the hidden message in that that's not hidden now, because I've told you. But imagine that you were an artist in that situation, that you had no rights to colour. Would it be efficacious to say, right, well, actually, I'm a landscape artist. I love to paint fields and stuff. Please, can I have green paint? I will get the approval of the senior government artist. I'll operate under license or under supervision, but please, can I have green paint? And the government comes along and says, you know what, you've made a very good case. We'll let you have green paint. There's going to be tax on it, obviously. You'd be paying extra VAT on it. You'd only be allowed one pot of supervised tonal green paint every month. Make the most of it. And you go, yeah, we've got the green paint, we've won. But actually, there'd be a whole new raft of regulations about this green paint. And was it the lack of green paint that was really the problem? Or was it the fact that they actually took the position that they control objects and your access to those objects to such an extent that they can predetermine what kind of pictures you can paint? Because that is what they're doing. They're saying that you can only exist like this, and you can't have this green in your existence, but you can't have anything else either. The problem is not the lack of green paint. The problem is the fact that they've got the audacity and the power to determine what it is. So this is what I'm talking about, horizons. We don't think much is possible, and therefore we're trying to think of what is the narrowest, thinnest end of the wedge that we could possibly insert, so that somebody, this poor child, I remember stories in the media, some poor child would benefit from medicinal cannabis. Let's campaign that a doctor can prescribe a particular form of cannabis to this particular patient, and everybody's going to get behind that campaign, and that's going to solve the problem. Whilst, of course, that patient should have access to the cannabis, and everybody means well. It's not that people have bad intention, but their perspective is very much like on the shop floor. It's not that they are looking down as supervisors of that shop floor and saying, well, how's the whole operation working? Yeah. They're not pulling back and looking at the big picture, and they're operating in the sort of lowest common denominator terms that might just possibly be acceptable to the Daily Mail. And I find this a very strange way of campaigning, and it was a thought that left me particularly poignantly after Product Earth and Science Festival, where we recently re-met, having spoken previously. Yeah, and I was left with a feeling that there was something quite surreal about the idea of campaigning around one plant rather than campaigning around human liberty. I think we should sort of possibly explore that a bit more, either now or later, because I recognise that I will be sort of popping up some people's balloons here a little bit, because the more I read of the professional and high sort of flying cannabis organizations that have come up, the more I start to see this as a bit of a fetish, and it's sort of almost quasi-religious in tone. And I don't want to alienate the listeners. I want to, I'm on your side. I'm on our side. I'm not adverse to cannabis or anything like that at all, but I'm not sure that our terms of reference are really powerful, and I'm trying to make that more powerful, because I don't believe that the thin end of the wedge argument is necessarily persuasive, that if we gain some more liberty over cannabis plants, that everything will fall into place. I mean, the main problems with drug misuse in Britain actually stem from alcohol misuse, smoking heavily, over-the-counter drugs being misused, prescription drugs being misused, and then we've got the whole crack, heroin, cocaine sort of, self-indulgent behaviours, all kinds of, stimulant misuse. We've got all of these things that are really sharp and urgent problems that are really affecting people's lives. And to talk specifically about things which are, I will use this word fetish, because it's a fetish of a fetish of a fetish, because we start off, we are ourselves, and as I said earlier on, we are permeable to the whole of our environment, and we've kind of narrowed it down to a plant, and then who can actually supply that plant and for what. So we've kind of made a fetish of the substance and the function of what is really a quintessential issue about human liberty and our status as subjects of this realm.
I'm gonna take this as a point to interject and say, you're entirely right, and I've repeated that analogy probably 30 times since I heard you say that to me just a couple of weeks ago, because it so perfectly encapsulates something that has been scratching under the surface in my consciousness for a long time. I kind of got in trouble, to be honest with you, from this the cannabis community several years ago, when I was all drugs. That was the argument I made. I went, look, I'm pro cannabis, which means I'm pro heroin, which means I'm pro crack. I'm pro the access to the drug. The drug is benign. It is inactive, cannot do nothing. It's not sneaking into kids' bedrooms and getting them hooked on it. The whole theories of addiction and chemical hooks and all this shit manipulated science. And I did a documentary about LSD with the BBC and the Victoria Derbyshire show, and I got in so much shit, and people were like, you're harming the movement, you're muddying the waters, you're mixing up these substances, and was kind of, probably shouldn't have, but I was kind of beaten into submission, and I kind of went, all right, I'll concede, I'll focus entirely on cannabis. And in that, kind of, again, the same as a lot of other people, got lost within the minutiae of that. And I can understand for a lot of people how and why, but I'm hoping for a lot of my listeners and viewers that maybe have it intrinsically, instinctively, a bit of a backlash towards this internally, is that you've got to then have that empathy. You've got to be able to exactly like get off the shop floor, go and observe the mechanisms, the matrix in which we live, and the people and the stations in which they're positioned, because we're all cogs in a giant machine kept there artificially, as you're stating, by their ability to control the outcome of our lives. I mean, Christ, you could take a kid from any background, regardless of what it is, and go and give them an ayahuasca experience and make sure they're not full of debt, whatever else. They could go off and do anything. Everybody will share a common blueprint, and yes, through epigenetics and all the rest of it, things change. But I have an expression that I believe more than I believe anything I've ever believed in my life. And that is that if I was born you, raised as you, and lived as you, I would be you. And what I extrapolate from that then is there's one consciousness. So therefore, if it's not right that something is not right for me, it's not right for anybody. So as you said, it's about getting back, or as I alluded to earlier, kind of getting back to that we are nature. As you said, that we've worked so hard to separate ourselves from these things, when that is what is creating the consequences. That is the perception that people have of that heroin user, that crack user. And you know what I mean? I've just cracked open Carl Hart's latest book, Dr. Carl Hart. He took some flack recently because he came out and went, you know what? I've just started my 5th year as a recreational heroin user. And he explained that obviously, you know, he's still got his positions at 2 prestigious universities, writing his book, raising a family, and all the rest of it. And there were people within all forms of activism and corners that were just a bit, were thrown by it. And it kind of really did put the, I don't know what the analogy is here, but it separated the group, you know what I mean? And since then, I've been really acutely aware of this, and I've tried to get the cannabis people to understand that actually what's happening now, to go back to our earlier point about the importance of language, is we're singing from their hymn sheet. They've got us begging for legalization, which, as I've been exploring over the past few episodes, and as Dennis McKenna kind of agreed that I hit on the head last week, is that prohibition is basically the last kind of death throw of, legalization is the death throw, the last grasp effort of prohibition to hold that system. To go, okay, we can't outright ban these things, so what we can do is control their outcomes. So we're now seeing ketamine clinics, we're soon going to see MDMA and DMT clinics. And in those settings, they are very homogenized, very standardized and hygienic, and that you're not going to have that same revelatory experience. You're not going to, you know, talk to the machine elves or see the greys or all of these other different kind of experiences you can have on these really high dose entheogenic experience compounds in the right setting. And I think that is just, it's going to allow us that little bit further exploration. So as we're seeing like now, LSD was tune in, turn on, drop out. Then it became, oh no, microdose it because it helps your productivity. We're now seeing the same with MDMA of going, that's the rave drug, 90, sweaty. Let's get cuddly and dirty around a big bass scoop. You know what I mean? Now it's like, no. We're going to keep you together as a couple because it's more economically viable for you to stay together. We're going to use it to treat veterans coming back from war zones. Why? So we can rehabilitate them and get them straight back out there again. They're weaponizing these substances from underneath us. They're now going, all right, what have we done? We've created a pandemic with an epidemic of alcoholism, or now as they call it, alcohol abuse disorder. Don't know why they changed the language. So then they're going, all right, let's use ketamine and let's use other substances to deal with that. Not again so they can make them sober, but so they can get them back to a regular maintenance use of the drug again. And
this is the fear of the spiritual side, though. Again, it always has to be a pragmatic benefit for the material dimension, the particular system that we live in. And so we end up arguing in their terms. And it is all down to language. You're so right, because I didn't see, bless you, I didn't see your Victoria Derbyshire episode. I imagined that the language wasn't as rigorous as it might be, based upon, you know, the learning that you've done since then about this. Because as soon as, you know, people say, well, oh, so you want to legalize all drugs now? You know, we're just trying to legalize cannabis. But that whole premise, that whole linguistic structure that we're creating, it is actually an illusion in a very real sense. And we need to get to that, because ultimately we have to recognize that what legality means is not actually the status of an object, but actually the status of a human. So the only things that can be crimes, I've never seen a criminal case about anything other than what somebody has done or not done.
Human, always a human.
It's always that. So legality is something that you do that is not covered by criminal law, and illegality is something that you do or fail to do. It could be an omission. If you have a duty of care to do something, you've got to stop the train because it says red, and you just don't do anything. You say, well, I didn't do anything. Well, no, but your omission is a crime. So what's the difference between you acting illegally or this idea that a substance is illegal? Because we imagine it's entirely the same thing, that I really am just playing with words here to suggest it's different. And that what I'm doing is an exercise in just, I'm being pedantic about semantics in a way. Whereas law is words. And that means that it's not that you can just think of some other words to describe the law. The law is the word, and it's nothing more. It's a bit like a building is made of those bricks, mortar, plaster, and everything. That's what it is. And the law is those words. And when you play with them using common parlance, ordinary everyday speech to describe it, you may get away with it, but otherwise you may end up creating a complete sort of straw man edifice that is unassailable, and it's more problematic to deal with. And the reason people don't think that there's any difference between these ideas, so I'll give you two ideas. One is a drug which is illegal to possess without lawful authority, exemption, or license. And what I mean by that is that, like, a police officer has a lawful authority, he doesn't need a license to take the cannabis or other drug off you. And or you could have a license issued by the Home Office to have that, or you could just have an exemption. There could just be a broad-based exemption to say, well, possession of a certain amount of cannabis that's not involved with commerce is completely allowed. You could just do that with the existing law. So is a drug which is illegal to possess without license, exemption, or authority an illegal drug? Because an illegal drug doesn't exist in law. Let's be very, very clear. There's no such thing. Although judges sometimes use that expression, it's actually entirely false. And the reason we accept it so readily as the same is because of a figure of speech that we use all the time. And that figure of speech, and I have to be whenever I say this, I'm always a little bit careful, because people are not familiar with the expression I'm going to use, and it kind of phases them, and they start thinking, I can't keep up with this now, I'm losing it. But it's nothing to actually fear. It's just called a transferred epithet. And what it means is that we give our quality, the human quality, to an object. So instead of saying, I'm looking to buy a stick to help me with my walking, I give it to the object and say, I want to buy a walking stick, even though that stick will never take the dog out for a walk. Now, of course, if I was to say that to you, if you said, I'm going to buy a walking stick next week, and I said, don't you mean the stick to help you with your walking? You would think I'd be ridiculous. And I am, because we know exactly what you mean. The same way we know that a disabled toilet isn't a broken toilet, it's a toilet for disabled access. So go back to what I'm saying about the law. It's made of words. And as soon as you start using these shortcuts and these expressions, what you've actually done is cut yourself out of the equation. And when I say the equation, what I mean is that law, and this is back to the administration I was talking about at the top of the show, is that law balances your liberty as a subject with public protection. That's what its laudable goal is, so that they don't sort of say, well, in order to stop crime, everybody's locked down, like they did with coronavirus, just an experiment, really, just to see if we could do it, lock everybody down. They don't do that. They say, well, if you go out equipped with a knife and you've got or tools for robbery, burglary, that then that action, in the interest of public safety, we will make a law about that. So they don't just
so
they don't just like block everything. They make an equation to try and balance reasonable liberty with reasonable public protection. And that equation is completely destroyed by the idea of the illegal object with drug law, or cannabis law, if you prefer to talk about that. Because what happens is that you act illegally just by having some cannabis in a drawer somewhere that, as you say, doesn't do anything. It doesn't encourage children. It doesn't do anything. It's just in a drawer. It's completely benign. And yet, because there's no proportionate regulations about the social harms and your liberty at all, then you have no rights. You are enslaved by the idea of that object, because in a way you are that object now, because you believe that that cannabis is illegal. And this is the way that the whole system thinks. It operates on the premise that it is illegal and therefore there's nothing that you can do. But actually, it's an entirely false notion based upon this transferred epithet idea that because something is illegal to possess without all of these caveats that you could actually be allowed to have, which is what we want. That's exactly what we want. We want the law to use those regulatory options, not regulating cannabis or drugs, really. They're regulating you and your access to the effects, which is what it's really about. You're accessing your conscious mind. Sorry, they're regulating the conscious mind through these. But instead of allowing peaceful dominion over the self to do that, they're saying, well, no, it is illegal. Now, as soon as you believe that you can legalize it, you're falling into the trap of all or nothing, absolutism, because then people are going to say, oh, you want to legalize all drugs? How irresponsible. Even legalizing cannabis, it sounds irresponsible to a lot of people. Part of the fact it's, as I say, it's a misnomer, because it's absolutist. So they say, oh, so you want children to have cannabis, do you? You want it okay to make, cannabis brownies and just, pretend it's normal cake, do you? And just let people eat it and see what happens. Is that what you're talking about? So, well, no, I don't mean that. I mean, we should be regulated. We should be this. But you said legalization of a thing, which means that you're doing the same mischief as what the government are doing, in a way, that you're presenting something as it's all or nothing. It's a kind of binary between legality and illegality of objects. And that makes us slaves, because slaves were deemed as property, and drugs are property. And as soon as you give the legal agency to the drug through this reversal of speech, which seems very natural to us, which is why people don't quite get what I'm saying now, because their mind starts thinking, hang on, this can't be right. I've been talking about legalization of cannabis for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. I've been talking about this. How could this guy come along today, never heard of him, and start saying I'm talking rubbish? But there's one thing I'm certain about, is that what I'm talking now is legally correct, is that there is no such thing. Cannabis cannot be legal or illegal. And the legal drug idea is as insidious as the illegal drug idea, because this is how they create what we call the artificial divide. And the artificial divide is often seen, you see these things on Facebook, cannabis on one side, green, alcohol on the other side, red, legal, illegal, or the other way around, sorry, illegal, legal. And then a list of characteristics of the user, that cannabis users don't kill people, they don't do this, they don't do that, whereas alcohol does this. And it's this binary thing. Yeah. Well, firstly, I never attack alcohol users or anybody else, because I am the possibility. We are all the possibility of being permeable to any psychoactive substance according to our behavior. If we behave badly, that's the time the law should come in. So what we're trying to rescue here, Simpa, is the threshold for interference by authorities. So there should be a certain point. So you could do some drugs in your house. It's nobody's business what you're doing or even what you're using. it is purely a private matter between you and your associates, colleagues, friends, or even just yourself. It's nobody's business. But as soon as you go outside and mug somebody to buy your next whatever it is, that's when the law should be sort of saying, okay, you can't just streak down the street in this society naked, even if you think it's appropriate because you've taken a very powerful psychedelic without any kind of structure or supervision. You suddenly think it's okay to run around naked. This is when, society says, well, hang on a second, there's something here that we need to do. And that is lost through this kind of binary idea that a thing is either legal or illegal, as opposed to judging a human being based upon what they do. And that's the way they treated slaves. They never saw them as personalities, as individuals, as rights-bearing at all. They became property. And I'm saying, in a way, one of the problems is that we see ourselves as property. And it's, to shoot down sacred cows like Peter Tosh, and who says legalize it, and they play that at 420. I heard it being played at 420. Things have to move on, and understanding has to move on. And this is one of the great things about drugs, is that this idea was born of a realization as part of a drug experience, because a drug experience allows somebody to view the situation from another angle. I think it was Einstein said you can never solve a problem at the level of the problem. You have to be able to see above the problem and see it in situ, in context, to really understand what to do about it. So that's where professionals and experts come in with all kinds of problem solving, is that they've got the experience to understand what that problem really is. Whereas some people, there's a problem with water coming into the boat, they just get a cup and they just keep bailing it out, and they would do that forever. Whereas somebody else would say, no, you need to fix that hole, otherwise your whole life's wasted. And it's that kind of mentality that will break this endless cycle, because we've been in this loop for a very, very long time. And therefore, I just encourage listeners and viewers to be prepared, to be flexible, to be fluid. This whole idea that what some drugs can do for you is to create this new ideas, neuroplasticity, new connections, is let go of some of the baggage of the language and the terminology that we're all using, or most of us are using, because it's not serving us well. There's a huge qualitative difference between the idea of controlled drugs and illegal drugs. Now, bear in mind that the controlled drugs is the official legal term, and it's much better than illegal drugs, because control implies regulation. You don't control a car by just putting it in the garage. You go out and you do all of the braking and steering, maneuvering. So what we're looking for are those regulations. And it's not that you're regulating drugs, you're regulating people. And I go further with this. So I go further and further with it to break the mold. The legal drugs misnomer is the most important. But I don't like any dehumanizing rhetoric about this. So even this idea of a war on drugs, it's so wrong. I mean, it's so dehumanizing, and it's literally incorrect, because, as we've said before, everything's drugs from sugar upwards, as it were, sugar to heroin. They're all drugs, but of course, they're not having a war on drugs in any sense of the words, because they are actually creating a protection racket to market certain drugs, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, tobacco, etc. So those are being given free. People have been given carte blanche effectively. I know there's other regulations about those things from outside the Misuse of Drugs Act at the moment, but let's be clear: the Misuse of Drugs Act doesn't actually exclude alcohol and tobacco. This is a mistake that I saw David Nutt make many, many years ago as Students for Sensible Drug Policy talk, where he did a Venn diagram, which is just like circles representing groups of people or ideas. And he had the Misuse of Drugs Act in one circle, And then he had alcohol and tobacco in other circles and said, well, they're outside the Misuse of Drugs Act. Actually, the Misuse of Drugs Act, although they never, when they envisaged it in 1970, when we were preparing it, really thought about alcohol and tobacco being drugs. They never sort of came out and said, well, this law is not about alcohol, tobacco, or pharmaceuticals. They just said drugs, and it's any drugs that can be misused. And of course, it is the Misuse of Drugs Act, not the Use of Drugs Act. So the intention was to differentiate between drugs which can be misused and cause social problems and drugs which have uses and can be used peacefully or with good intent.
Yeah.
So
sorry, I'm eager to jump back in. Sorry.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I think you covered some brilliant points that I think I just wanted to kind of, I guess not necessarily translate, but reiterate in my own tongue and verbiage for any listeners that may have missed the point. It is not by any way us two being arseholes about this. Obviously, I've taken a lot of flack personally over the past couple of years for really digging into language, because I discovered exactly that. There is legalese. This is the legal definition and interpretation and understanding of what this word means within the realm of the judiciary that is related to judicial and the everything, CPS, police, court, crimes, all of that stuff, all of that. So that is with it, legalese operates within that. Then we have obviously our dictionary defined common language, which often there are crossovers in a Venn diagram of these where the same word means often two very, very different things. And you came with a wonderful narrative there of saying, like, say, a knife, a chef, for example. You walk down the street, with a knife tucked into your waistband, cops are going to pull you over because that knife they suspect you are carrying unlawfully, not illegally. So again, very nuance of difference. In legal is a very black and white thing. So like rape, for example, is illegal. It's not you're getting done for unlawful rape. So there's this real nuance within the subtle difference of legal and lawful. So there's one of the main ones that we need to be aware of, because if we don't, exactly as Darryl's saying, we fall into these false dichotomies and we create these binaries that we then end up camping on. We go, well, I'm this, I'm not that. And so we see this in legalization versus decriminalization, so-called medical versus rec, CBD versus THC. It's the system trying to, in my opinion, correct itself so that it can have its cake and eat it. It wants and needs there to be the mechanism that it can go, aha, you person I don't like, you bad person that we are racist, classist against, you have an object that we can use this current interpretation of this antiquated system to criminalize, to penalize you, to remove you from that situation, to hinder your progress in life, to limit your conscious expansion, as we're saying here. And I think it is a point that we have to then come back to is, all respect to Peter Tosh, to Bob Marley, to every living legend that has ever stood and fought for cannabis, for any drug, that has seen a person's inalienable right to alter and play with their consciousness. Look, if we let kids play dizzy ducks, or whatever you folks call it, wherever you're from, which is where a toddler spins the fuck around until they pass out, effectively, that's them getting high. Until you go through puberty, you don't get a gyroscopic sort of mechanism within your brain. So you then start producing, guess what these things are going to be? They're going to be endocannabinoids, endogenous cannabinoids within the system. So they're getting high off an action, yet we're not criminalizing it. Then think of your joggers, for example. We now know that runner's high, for example, is endogenous cannabinoids within the system. Yet we're not trying to criminalize the action of them running around in Lycra. We're not seeing people, jogging at traffic lights and getting pulled over going, you're going to go for a run, aren't you? You're going to go get high, aren't you? So it is real. We need to draw out these spaces, because if we allow them, which is what they want to, legalize it, then what they do is they ignore the bullshit scenario and system they've created and put a whole new operating system of bullshit on top of that, where it's not only that you've won back green, but they now get to come and approve each of your paintings. They get to come and, as you said, make sure how much you've got in your house. And while they're there, they get to look at all the other things you're doing. So we're then further giving up more liberty for a slight victory that ultimately is quite Pyrrhic. Is it really worth this surrender when actually millions of people now within legal marketplaces in places like California and Canada are still operating outside of that legal system because it doesn't serve their needs? So therefore, if legalization doesn't serve our needs, we need to then fight for something else. And I think this is where, again, that language is so important, because we don't currently have it. We're given that false binary of going, oh, you're not legalized, you mean decriminalize. And I'm like, well, yes, in a certain way, because when people are actually saying legalize in my community that are not understanding this nuance, what they mean in their heads is to make legal what is currently not legal for them to do.
Yes.
It's that simplistic, but in terms of the way the language is structured, the act of legalization is to make legal. So therefore you bring it into this legalese framework of regulations and restrictions, as you say. But then we're giving them this power, this autonomy, as you say, we're surrendering it to the oppressor, to the people that for 50, 60 years have broken down our doors, vilified us, criminalized us, searched us, going through airports, going into courtrooms and all sorts of other dehumanizing actions that they've subjected us to over these decades. And now we're going, oh, Mr. Oppressor, if you just gently lift the boot off, or, can we polish the boot maybe? That'd be really nice. It'd be softer on my neck. We've lost exactly that. This thing, we need to really stand up, and
we need to put ourselves back in the equation at every step. And the difficulty we face is that it's not as pretty to speak it without using sound bites and snappy things, because it becomes unwieldy to actually say what we actually mean, and it isn't so simple to actually.
It goes back to what you were saying before about that rhetoric trick that we did with surrendering human autonomy onto an object in sentencing. It was basically just to make English smaller. If you, like I like to read literature from 100 plus years ago, you're reading 3 pages and he said one sentence because of how we spoke in such a way. Now we're speeding up our language and shortening it. So another one of these binaries that obviously I'm exploring in videos and concepts at the minute is this medical concept, which is absurd, because the correct terminology in language is medicinal use of cannabis, but that's not sexy. It doesn't fit in your hashtag. It's not a search engine optimized thing, whereas medical cannabis is. But exactly,
you still want to categorize it. You're still trying to categorize it, and you know how crazy it sounds that you might have a few aches and pains, but you want to relax with some cannabis, for example. To say that this is a medical use, a recreational use, or a spiritual use, and then, I've actually been in courts and they've said, well, I've heard cases about medicinal, but I suppose this is recreational now. How ridiculous. It's not reality. When you take something, it's much more holistic than that, isn't it? It works in so many different levels, and your prime objective may be to solve some emotional or physical discomfort by doing it, but to actually break it down into these divisions. It's all about these divisions of self, actually, that is happening, is that we are complete beings, and rather than present ourselves as this magnificent possibility of being harmonious and well, is that we divide ourselves up into all of these subcategories for approval, like you were saying. But I'm very wary about talking about using a substance like psilocybin. They're saying there's a petition running at the moment, and I'm not against it, but I'm aware of the problems of it. That they want to allow psilocybin to be used in the therapeutic context for particular conditions that do not respond well to conventional treatments, under the auspices of a qualified psychiatrist and clinic, to give particular doses, in particular protocol of commercially produced synthetic psilocybin. And that is another kind of Trojan horse meant idea, supposedly, when you question it, to say, well, once we've done this, once we've removed the stigma that psilocybin isn't just for crazy hippies, but it has a use, then we can take that elsewhere. But what we've really done is we've divided ourselves. I mean, it doesn't even apply to us. It applies to supposedly other people less fortunate than us. So I'm signing a petition for David Nutt or Ben Sessa or somebody else.
It was just to clarify, it was the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group that commissioned. So
Yeah.
just to give people a bit of context, I personally haven't signed it and will not, because as you're saying, it is, even the wording of it is, they want to schedule it. They want to reschedule psilocybin, and effectively, I think what they're looking to do is actually move in an analog, because obviously they're producing psilocin. Because when we eat a so-called magic mushroom, or we convert it through various means, unless of course you use lemon tech, which is something that I learned in America, which is wonderful, where you just basically soak your mushrooms in lemon juice for 20 minutes, 20 minutes, and then down it, and basically you've done the catalyst conversion, so you don't get gut ache and you get to the psilocin a lot faster. But yeah, I think that's where they're going. I mean, look, they did the same thing with cannabis. They have not rescheduled cannabis. What they did is the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, cannabis is Schedule 1. It has no accepted medicinal value. They then, under the 2001 regulations, per a caveat they did in the 2018 law, they created a Schedule 2 for medicinal cannabis, which they described, medical cannabis is the words they actually used, hyphenated, capitalized, very important if you understand how language works. The definition of which is a CBPM, a cannabis-based medicinal product designed for human consumption, which when you look at that under the legislation says is / and or a preparation is. So they're saying that all of this language says that it's cannabis, because they have to close the loop on the legal aspect of it, because it has to make sense in law. Even if the law is bastardized and it's immoral, it has to be circular. Everything has to reference back into it, which is why the supposed position of people like yourselves and judges and others within it, the human element, are supposed to find the fragility, the fallibility, and to test that fairness at every point. And we've completely lost that. And as you say, I think this is the perfect example of it for me. I mean, I'm not going to name the individual, but I've tried to get on a doctor, maybe one that was mentioned or not, allegedly, might have been one of those people that was just spoke of, and have been refuted by their employer. And I'm not allowed to have a conversation with them. And basically, I just wanted to talk about, how is it fair that ketamine can be sold at $6,000 for 3 infusions to treat depression and alcoholism in clinics in Bristol and London, but then festival goers that take it in there at Tret, like you may as well have taken in half a fucking key of fucking coke to your average festival, since what happened at Boomtown and others, and the deaths related to it. They've completely disproportionized it. They've actually lifted it in classifications with a class B now as well. But obviously they didn't move the schedule, because otherwise how would they create all these clinics and all this profitable market space for it?
Well, who's going to hold the keys? That's what it's all about. Ultimately, it's a battle that's going on. And we've seen the way that pharmaceutical companies have behaved over the coronavirus thing, because they've completely skewed the evidence of their so-called vaccines. And I'm not going to get into any kind of rabbit holes about that situation, other than to point to the power that they have to corrupt politicians. Corporations can be the problem. We're seeing the rise of corporations now trying to get onto the bandwagon. And even these, they're subject to, they're liable to do this lazy misrepresentation about things. I mean, a lot of those psilocybin groups, when you see them promoting their wares on social media, they use an emoji or even a photograph of Amanita, because Amanita looks so much, Amanita muscaria, that's the red fungi with white spots. It looks so much more sexy than a psilocybe, doesn't it? And so, it's okay, we'll just show psilocybes as Amanitas, notwithstanding the fact that there'll be loads of teenagers who think, that's what they're talking about. We'll go and eat 5, whatever.
5 grams of that in darkness, Jesus Christ.
3 or 4 of those uncooked with a bit of lemon juice. I mean,
stomach hurts thinking about that. Wow, that would not be cool.
But just think about how many people are so desperate to be cool and to use anything that seems convenient, even though substantially it's a category error. And when we use our language to talk about, we want to legalize psilocybin or something like that, whatever they're trying to say, is that's a category error as well, because we're actually making something that isn't true. We're actually creating a whole edifice that isn't even there. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't mind those corporations so much getting into the bandwagon, but they want to getting onto the bandwagon, but they want to hold the keys. And when I say the keys, is that what these molecules represent as they're out there, as we're all permeable to them, is that these are the key molecules that actually allow the functioning of the human being to work on different levels. There must be an infinite number of different ways of being that are chemical realities based upon the ingestion of some psychoactive substance. And the key, those molecules open up a pathway to see reality differently. There are different realities, some of which may be legitimate, some of which may be illusory. But that's entirely a matter for discrete groups and individuals to determine whether or not, the messages or the perceptions they're having are important or entirely hallucinatory. But those keys are really important, and they want to hold those keys. And I think if pharmaceutical companies get the keys to drugs, as they want with cannabis, they want with magic mushrooms, and they ultimately will do with ketamine and everything else that has any kind of specific medical benefit. And I think almost any drug, the reason why it's popular, the reason why it's a drug is that it has an effect and it's interesting at the very, very least. But do we really want to hand power to those people? But at the same time, what they're doing is that they are helping remove stigma, and they are educating the public about the possible benefits of these things from this quagmire of stigma and believing that people who use these things are completely deluding themselves and wasting their time at best. So what we really need is concurrent to all of these like Trojan horse ideas, that may not even be Trojan horses, but just power grabs, is this idea of cognitive liberty, this idea that, that each individual has a divine entitlement just by their existence to be free to explore their own consciousness or consciousness, not that we own it. But it's that if they use the right language, I would be less angry about this, because then they would be doing two things at once. They wouldn't be profiteering out of the criminalization of everybody that isn't fulfilling their criteria, which is exactly how their business model works. They can't sell ketamine at £6,000 if there's somebody outside the clinic saying, you know what, I'll sell you a gram now for 20 quid. There's 10 doses there based upon their protocol. Go home with a friend who's done a bit of counseling or psychotherapy or somebody you really trust, and snort a line of that and see how you get on. Saved yourself a fortune. But no, that guy selling that ketamine could be in real trouble. They'll probably call the police. The clinic will say, there's somebody outside our ketamine clinic selling ketamine. Because otherwise they're not going to work. So their business model is predicated upon the premise that it is illegal except for us.
Yeah.
And whilst I understand that there has to be a kind of an evolution into understanding these things, and that doctors and scientists have a very important role in that, I don't like it when they misuse the framework and misrepresent the framework and don't support this idea that people can do it. In fact, they go out of their way to say, we're clearly not recommending this for any other people outside it. You've got to have soft cushions, you've got to have ambient lighting, you've got to have a qualified doctor. All of these things. They've even tried to patent that idea that their therapy is done in a room that is conducive to having a relaxing experience. We're going to put a blindfold on the guy and put headphones on him. Oh, well, I never thought of that before, taking drugs and chilling out.
Sorry, I just wanted to, I had Danny Kushlik, founder of Transform. And he brought up when I had him on, definitely got to get him back on. Brilliant guy. There was a company trying to patent a pillow. It was a pillow? Yeah, pillow and a weighted blanket. Yeah. So they've basically got, this is a therapeutic drug blanket. It's only, and it's like, we figured that out as teenagers. We had drug rugs, as we called them. Everyone grabbed your drug rug. We were going down the beach on a Friday. You'd set up, everyone had a cozy, everyone would wrap up around the fire. You'd have certain softest thing in the world when you're on MDMA. It's like, we figured that shit out. All of this, they have stole from us. So this is the argument I had with a certain representative from one of the cannabis clinics at Product Earth. was that the only reason they know anything that they know is because when they were spending decades saying that we were lunatics and that our drug use was destroying us and causing all our problems, we did the hard evidence and research. We're the ones that proved and provided these data sets. And now all of a sudden you're interjecting and going, yeah, okay, I'll sell you it. I'll like, fuck right off. Do you know what I mean? The medicinalization of certain compounds, I agree, is necessary. There will be obviously certain protocols that you can make it hit a certain efficacy rate, 90% of whatever in certain circumstances with whatever. But that is always only ever going to be small. It can only ever be small. Because actually, if we healed the trauma in culture, if we were just allowing 16-year-olds to just go and pick magic mushrooms, the same as I did, just go off and we're going to camp next to the golf course, and then at 5 a.m. we're going to get up and you eat two, you put one, you eat two, you go back and you heat them on a camp stove, and all of these rituals, these rites of passage that if we had those fucking things, we wouldn't need those things. So they're trying to, and this is what I'm saying about it being the last death throes, they're trying to cage us in, trick us into this verbal matrix, and then we'll stand there and defend it for them. We'll self-police in this pseudo psychedelic Oculus where we assume that everybody is, having the same trip, the same experience, and none of us will be allowed to, I don't know, have the night me and three mates did on acid, where we just basically imagined a lettuce being God. I don't know why we had a lettuce in the house, and it was the lettuce head, and all hail the lettuce, and it was an absurd abstraction viewed as probably fucking what's the word, as having individual psychiatric breaks, like our psyche is deluded and deranged, but we had fucking fun. The next morning we woke up and we laughed about it, you know what I mean, and we moved on with our lives. It was, we should be allowed that play, that absurdity, that loss of
corporations sanitize everything, don't they? Like that Bedrocan, but it's like this shopping mall kind of mentality. You have the big companies and they push out all the independents. I remember in Leeds and the Corn Exchange and various places in town, there was so many independent shops and goth shops and punk shops and weird stuff, and they're all disappearing. And same with clubs. There used to be all these independent music venues where small acts would play, or you get really alternative music. And now it's all sanitized and corporate and bland. And this is the future of taking something which is exciting and trying to sanitize it. And part of the problem with the language is that we try to talk about drugs, but really the communication is chemical. So it's what we call it ineffable. If people don't know what that word means, it just means it's beyond language. So that the experience of taking any drug, really, obviously more appropriate with psychedelics, I guess, but any substance, you can't really communicate to another person in words what that's about. And yet people have spent years trying. You've got great writers, Huxley and other people, will try to open the doors of perception in words. But at the end of the day, you can read all of those books, Carlos Castaneda, whoever you like, you'll never really know what it's like to take peyote. Not even close. You wouldn't even get to first base. I mean, it's good to talk because then you can describe, how to take it, what the right dose is. You can use science and empiricism to describe the context of the experience, but you'll never get into the experience because the communication is not verbal. It is a transformatory experience based upon a physiological change of being, so that everything is different. And we don't have the language. We never will have the language. The only way you can communicate what cannabis is like is say, here, try this, because then you're opening that pathway to communicate what that is about. And trying to break it down into these discrete functions with scientific rigor. And they've even tried to suggest that they can replicate the experience without the psychedelic effects, just to use. And of course, we know it's the whole thing. It's the whole entourage of different alkaloids and other things and setting that will actually be therapeutic or will be interesting. That's at stake.
Do you think that? Sorry. Do you think that speaks to their motives? Because what did I call it last week? Because me and Dennis brought it up. The high without the high. And to me, it speaks towards what they're trying to do. They've mapped in the brain, all right, if you take psilocybin or whatever doses, it'll reduce depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms for 4 or 5 weeks. So it feels like to me, to get rid of the high, I mean, what that does to me is I take, say, LSD or whatever, and I have a high dose and I have an uncomfortable experience, what some might, I would say incorrectly, call a bad trip. Over the next few days, I have what I described on the Victoria Derbyshire show as a positive hangover, as in terms of my body feels good, my brain feels good. What I've then got is that period of integration of then going, Jesus Christ, I don't know, like there's one experience I speak of, that one day I'm going to do a video just on it, of like when I ate LSD and I was watching Austin Powers, I had like a break from sort of reality, and I lived through all of these different beings dying on my bathroom floor, cuddling a bath mat. And like talking about the synesthesia I felt of hearing the sound of da 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 da, because it was a DVD like on loop, and that was one of the most the best experiences of my life, one of the most difficult. But from that, I became vegan. I woke up the next day vegan. It was just done. I walked into a supermarket and I couldn't see the other shit. It was such a weird instant transformation. It brought me to a level of awareness and empathy that I have never had in my life. Like I just couldn't look at anything suffering without just being emotionally driven to it, like just it was my being in essence, was to feel empathy and connection because of that experience. Whereas if they then took the high away, all I'd have got from that is a couple of days of being all right, cool. I wouldn't have had that revelatory experience. I think that's what the high is for, is you get the reset of certain neurochemistry and you get kind of, a deflating of certain areas. And I think what we're seeing with hemispheric connection and the lighting up of certain parts of the brain is a cleansing of all that other shit. So of course you're going to feel better. But like I said, I think that abstract experience, especially of something like salvia, DMT, any of your sort of Changa blend mixes and stuff, that you're going into such an abstract world from yourself that there is metaphor, there is meaning within that. And in the same as like we've studied dreaming for centuries, we don't have a fucking clue what it means. You know what I mean? I would much rather we could go and treat drugs like love. Do you know what I mean? We have spent centuries writing about it and trying to quantify it, and you can't. And we accept that. And we just go that just you'll be in love. Well, you'll know it when this happens to you. And then it happens and you go, all right. And it's like you're in the club. And the same is true of these experiences, is we shouldn't be pushing them through legalization, as in, I don't want to see DMT on every street corner. Do you know what I mean? We used to have an expression sort of in my community in the North, and in the people I work with around the UK, is that if somebody comes to you for DMT, you don't give them DMT. If then at a certain point it arises that it just like the synchronicity of the universe times it right, and they're kind of in a point of need and in comfort, and there's somebody who can trips it, etc., can do that, then you give it to them. Whereas now there are vendors just selling the carts to anybody and everybody, and people are having experiences that they're not then doing the work to integrate. And I think then they're getting and can end up getting more lost. So rather than having this opening experience and humbling, which is the point of the psychedelic experience, is to humble you into going, I don't know a lot. I can't know a lot. I know what's in front of me. I am right now. Anything is a memory that is tainted and is fading forever. And anything beyond me is anxiety and uncertainty that I cannot plot or plan. And whereas some people are now taking these substances and they're fortifying their ego, as it were, rather than having this dissolution of the default mode network and a separation of themselves like I did. And as my consciousness repeats itself, I mean, after every acid experience, I feel my consciousness repeats it. And I can almost for 24 hours, 48 hours, really look at a certain area and go, oh, that's what I want to work on, and keep that file open. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's very insightful. And I don't think really you can be any kind of drug policy expert and not have at least the basic experiences in the drugs you're talking about, because it's really like a blind person trying to describe the colors, that they've been told about. It really is quite absurd that a lot of people in drug policy pride themselves on their abstinence of those substances. And the idea that the high is a dirty word, it has to be removed as an unwanted side effect, is quite ridiculous. Like you say, you're going to get high, you're going to have this afterglow of integration when you think about what's being shown to you. And yes, we live in a very drug ignorant society. Ultimately, I mean, if I was sort of a bit more anarchistically inclined, I would say, well, I don't mind, people being sold DMT cartridges. But because it's a drug ignorant society, there is a transient need for regulation. So,
or at least very least education.
Yes. Well, some regulation, because it's not the end goal, in the same way that human rights are not the end goal. Ultimately, for you, if you lived in a utopia, you wouldn't need human rights, because what human rights mean is that somebody's subjugating you, oppressing you, something's not right, and you have to go to a judge who is not elected. He represents some elite body. You may even end up in a foreign court, because we're still under the auspices of the European Court, asking for somebody to make a decision for you, and that is an abdication of responsibility. But we need human rights to protect us in order to transcend the fact that we need them, so that we have freedom of expression, sufficient area to move, so that ultimately we can progress society to a better form, whereby we're less reliant on contentious legal matters to solve problems, that we're working together collectively, communally. Yeah. And in the same way with drugs, ultimately the end goal would be that we live in an educated society, like you say. So perhaps there would be university courses in practical drug use, where year one you're exploring cannabinoids and other things, and you'll end up in year three doing the DMT, and ultimately we integrate the positive sides of this through a lot of knowing into a society where these things are options. They're never compulsory. That's back to cognitive liberty. I want to say cognitive liberty means that you have complete freedom, short of interfering with other people's freedoms, to explore that. But the flip side of it is that they can't force you to take drugs or coerce you. I mean, we've witnessed quite recently with the vaccination program, this idea of coercion, so that informed consent, which is the prerequisite of the NHS mandate really about medical treatment, is that the patient shall have informed consent, which is why if you go into hospital, you end up being told 20 times that what could possibly go wrong, until the point you're a nervous wreck, and then you're signing all these forms, say, I don't mind if you accidentally remove the wrong leg. It's just one of those things, isn't it? But informed consent is very important, and duress of circumstances and coercion negate that. So if they say that you can't travel, or you're not allowed to go clubbing unless you take these vaccines, and you agree to take it, you never had informed consent. You were forced into doing it. So the idea is that you have the complete freedom not to have, or to have, whatever it is that may benefit you or personally. I mean, there are some reasonable differentiations that should be made via the Misuse of Drugs Act to look at how we regulate people with regard to drugs. So I say regulate people with regard to drugs, just to keep ourselves in this paradigm, and not talk about regulating drugs, because to be pedantic at this point, drugs don't behave. They will not follow any regulations. You can't tax drugs either. You can only tax people. But I know that's going a bit far, but I have to do that, because it is a very personal, human-centric thing that we're talking about. So education, yes. And what do we educate people is how not to harm themselves and others. So we should have reasonable differentiations, and these are all possible within the Misuse of Drugs Act. And if people really want to read it, because I know a lot of people want to abandon the act and get rid of it. And actually, I think if it is replaced, it will be replaced with something far worse, believe it or not. Even if we do have more access rights to psilocybin and cannabis, people say, great, it's all about that, but it isn't. It will be far more regulation. Is that the Misuse of Drugs Act is an incredible flexible tool. And the few things that you should know about it are, firstly, that it does not forbid the use of any drug in Britain except opium. So opium, I think it's a sort of a throwback to the Shanghai Conventions, the Opium War, that they decided opium use was not in the interest of society. And that stayed on the legislation so that it is actually illegal to use opium, but cannabis and all the other controlled drugs, there's no crime against using it. Now, people will say, well, how do you use a drug? Because the drug's not illegal, because there is no legality in a substance, and using a drug isn't illegal. So it's the possession of the drug that's illegal. Well, actually, no, because it's only the possession of the drug in the absence of the exemption or the authority or the license. So, and that's the target area, because exemptions are beautiful. I mean, they could just exempt, the whole of the general
everybody
public
over 18, yeah.
any offence with cannabis, other than the ones I was talking about, like spiking people's food and giving it to minors without justification.
But even they're already covered by other legislation. There would be, grievous bodily harm,
Yes.
etc. Antisocial behaviours for the ones we were talking about before, like streaking, etc.
Yeah, but I mean, if I was sort of redrafting the regulations of the Misuse of Drugs Act, I would point to the sort of things that I would say are rightly criminal, whether they're dealt with by that law or another law. I think we're all aware of what responsible uses are, but those responsible uses are not to your own health, actually, because the Misuse of Drugs Act doesn't set out to say we're going to minimize the harm to yourself. Now, admittedly, that if everybody harms themselves, that has ramifications for society. But we draw the line difference between somebody who might drink too much for his own God or their own good, and those that use it responsibly. We don't actually say that we're going to criminalize having more than 3 drinks a day or something like that, because we recognize that there's a certain freedom in not maximizing your health. You don't want compulsory aerobics at 7 o'clock, like you might see in China. Some societies, they literally say, right, you've got to look after yourself in the interest of society. I mean, it's not such a terrible idea in some utopian society that everybody works together and looks after themselves, but it's certainly not something we want government nowadays to be mandating, that 5-a-day vegetables are in fact compulsory now. Like, you literally have got a shopping basket with not enough vegetables, you've broken the law. And then we need to differentiate that from uses which may actually adversely affect other people directly. And I think alcoholism does fall into that category. Ultimately, if you are an alcoholic, you do affect other people adversely. It is possible that you can go too far. But nevertheless, the Misuse of Drugs Act is quite a useful tool, that it has this incredible flexibility. And if people want to check it out later, it's easy to Google it and get the full act. Don't get a summary, because it's always wrong. Wikipedia's full of mistakes. But if you actually look at the legislation, firstly, you will see that there's no crime of use. And I just reminded myself, I forgot to mention that is because they want to afford these differentiations between use and misuse. So that's what I'm trying to say. There's a difference between use and misuse. And that's what the law is supposed to do, is to do that. So, don't get rid of the Misuse of Drugs Act. I lost my thread what I was going to say before, but I think it still makes sense what I was saying.
I think entirely, actually, there's something that I was made aware of the other year that I'm still trying to get my little brain around. The more I've sat as Mackenzie friend in magistrates and in Crown, and I've watched this system. I've sat in rooms with barristers and heard them speak one way and then watched them perform. And that's the only way I can describe it, because them fuckers, they walk onto a stage and it's just an act. It's a pageantry. And so I'm slowly picking up more and more on this. And one of the things I learned was Section 28 of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, which is all predicated on belief. So that you can be, and there has to be, lawful actions by which you can be in possession of a substance if you knowingly weren't in possession of it. If somebody puts a drug in your bag, for example, you haven't consciously chose possession. And it's an interesting one then when it comes to cannabis, about cultivation. So cultivation is the human act of germination. Germination is the act of a seed sprouting and beginning its life cycle. But when a human intervenes with it, it is cultivation. So that requires intention. So obviously the Feed the Birds campaign and others figured out a while ago that if you were to scatter, cannabis seed from what they call so-called hemp seed, another one of those horribly binary false language things that we don't have time to get into. But that's not your intention, was to feed the bird. Consequently to your intention, cannabis might have grown from that seed, but you didn't germinate, you didn't cultivate it, it germinated. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so that would be a principle of law, really, that's pervasive across anything. If you didn't intend it, you may not have strict liability. There are laws of strict liability.
But then what we're saying now then is the semantics I have seen from the judges is that you, ex-person in the dock, you knew that cannabis was illegal. So, well, no, Your Honor, that's bullshit. It's not illegal. So they're building a trap. So I'm wondering if on this sincere belief argument of Section 28, whether we can then use awareness and knowledge of the law and legalese so that when they state that this is illegal, it's not. Our belief at the time of possessing the drug or growing the drug or whatever, if your sincere belief from doing the research led you to this conclusion, which is that the drugs cannot be illegal and I am being criminalized because on the auspice that an emphasis that the drug is illegal, although actually I've talked myself out of it because the charges are possession, cultivation, distribution, blah blah blah. But the intention, anyway, I think there's something there.
Yeah, I'm not 100% clear whether that's going to be a sort of a usable line of defense. I mean, I've just remembered, by the way, before we get back to that the sections that I was going to ask the viewers to look at, so they know what I'm talking about, of the Misuse of Drugs Act if they look it up. So I lost that bit before. The sections 7, 22 and 31, because those sections afford the minister who administers the law in tandem with the advisory council. Please remind me to ask about the advisory council in a minute, because this is the key another key that is missing out of the equation of justice here, that the advisory council are not doing their job. But those sections enable the minister to afford all kinds of rights to people to do it intentionally, whatever. Now, in terms of what you were just asking, you're almost sort of suggesting that if you've got like a sincere belief system that this is for the good of humanity, then it's okay to do it. And although kind of environmental protesters have come up with that recently, with destroying property, toppling statues and things like that, is that the courts actually, through juries, have allowed the idea that there is a greater good in this and that their intentions were to protect the planet, or some other concern that some people might think is rather twee. But it's it is possible to get a jury to believe that, but it isn't really what the law is about. The law is about telling you what you can do and what you can't do. And even if you've got an idea that it's not quite right, doesn't give you any leeway there to go and do it. So I'm not quite sure if that would be a working solution. It might be an argument for a jury to get what the court would think was a perverse verdict. There's always that option in the Crown Court. Just for, not that a barrister would do it, but you could do it as a Mackenzie friend, to actually say to the jury, I don't think a barrister would dare, but to say, well, you've heard everything that His Honour is going to say. He's going to tell you that if you're satisfied that this guy was trying to cultivate cannabis, he's guilty, and I'm telling you that is what the law says. But you as the jury, you're here as a democratic input, and actually, with no disrespect to the court, you're free to ignore everything the judge tells you. It's a matter of conscience. If you believe that this individual was acting reasonably and should not be sent to jail later today for doing this, you have the right to ignore every direction that the judge has given you to find this person guilty. And you can say, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to vote. I'm going to say he's not guilty. So there is always that potential, although often they close that down. There was what they call the Diplock courts in Northern Ireland, when there was sympathy for, I will use the word terrorist, but I know it's a loaded word because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. But people were minded to acquit people committing violent acts because of their political and social affiliations, and they understood there was a struggle, a war, and that people were being acquitted. And they responded to that by setting up these things called diplock courts without juries or with vetted juries and screening the juries and other things like that to get the result they wanted, which was, well, you have broken the letter of the law. There's no way out for you. So really what I'm trying to do is quite responsible in the ways you suggested earlier, that here am I, defense lawyer or former defense lawyer, trying to do these things. That's what it says on the tin, to be a defense lawyer. You should be doing these things. It's not, as the Malaysians thought, very naughty kind of disposition to try and argue that the law is not always the law. And that's the way things evolve, is people not accepting that things are just as they are. And like I said, the Misuse of Drugs Act is not set in stone in the sense that all these regulations or lack of regulations are there in perpetuity. They are meant to be managed. And this that links me back quite nicely to the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, which David Nutt sat as chair for 10 years, and nothing ever changed. And he was running the ACMD when Casey, the LSD chemist, was in prison. And Casey and I wrote beautiful letters to him, beautiful breakdowns. I mean, to say that I was involved, I have to say it was quite a small role that I was playing in the drafting of these documents, because he was brilliant at it. And I take my hat off to him as a mentor in this regard. But we gave him all the guidance that he needed, and that the idea that they were sitting on this idea that alcohol and tobacco were somehow outside of this law, or rather, I should say, correct myself, people producing, manufacturing, selling alcohol are outside the law. They're not. And we said, and he was always complaining about alcohol, always. And I said, well, just tell the minister that we're going to make alcohol a controlled drug, which doesn't really mean that alcohol is controlled. It's another one of those transferred epithets. It's that we are controlled with respect to alcohol, okay, just to flesh it out. And that we then make those regulations under those three sections, 7, 22, and 31, so that everything is reasonable. But I was representing people at that time in off licenses who've been selling bottles of vodka to 12-year-olds. And I would make a case, that they'd come in and they looked a bit more older than they were, and they were very persuasive, and the shopkeeper would let them have a bottle of vodka. It's not the end of the world. And I've seen people get off with like £80 fines for doing that. But if they were under the Misuse of Drugs Act, doing something very naughty like that, it is very naughty, selling spirits to children, you would be facing the same kind of consequences as somebody who did the same thing with a controlled drug. And that would only be fair, because the Misuse of Drugs Act is meant to be neutral. And what we've got is a completely biased, skewed administration based upon this artificial divide of legal and illegal drugs. So even if you break the law with a so-called legal drug, there are ramifications for it, but they're of a different order of magnitude. They're completely different. I've had the same magistrates, send people to prison for cultivation of cannabis and slap a tiny fine on an off license of business for unlawfully selling alcohol to minors. And so it is that neutrality. And we wrote to David Nutt at the Advisory Council, and we explained all the regulatory structure, and we explained many of the points of law and more that I've discussed so far, and I didn't get a reply. And also David Nutt, I think it was his successor, Professor Iveson, allowed magic mushrooms to become scheduled without any consultation. The Home Office just basically called him round and said, sign this, and they did it. Is that the Advisory Council should be our protector because the advisory council is supposed to be an independent body of experts, multidisciplinary experts from all walks of life, veterinary medicine, social sciences, and other things. It's missing something a bit more kind of shamanic or spiritual, actually, which is ultimately what it's about.
Yeah, missing drug users as well. Like, or, do you know what I mean? It feels weird to me that. Yeah, I often say you wouldn't get a tattoo from a tattooist that doesn't have tattoos, but there's also something a bit more pervasive here that I discussed with Ben Collins, and we, God, that was quite a while ago on the podcast. And we were talking about the intersectionality of the LGBTQ plus movement, and sort of with drug rights, and they as a community and movement always espouse this nothing about us without us. And it would seem absurd that you would put a bunch of straight people into a room to then go and work out the legislation for queer people. And it seems to me it's so abstract and alien to me, of this idea that you're getting a bunch of people who have studied predominantly from a prejudiced position the detrimental and negative consequences of these substances, while refusing to study or accept the positive benefits of them, to then make advisements on how extreme the government's approach to this should be. Yeah, it's just one of those things I wanted to get out there.
Yeah, sorry. The Home Office actually stage manage the advisory council, even though they're set up as an independent entity. So there's no independent funding for it. And they screen appointees who are volunteers, actually. They get paid expenses only. And people who are certainly not extreme by my standards, very moderate, people like Neem Eastwood from Release, she applied to be on it. I think, I'm trying to remember his name, I think Alex Stevens, an academic who's very minded towards reform, he wanted to be on it. And the Home Office screen it. The Advisory Council actually sit in the Home Office building, and they end up talking about the minutiae of some hardly ever used substance. They've never had a single meeting about alcohol and tobacco, the two most widely misused drugs in Britain, except in terms of polydrug misuse. So alcohol, obviously has a detrimental effect with tranquilizers. So they might mention the word alcohol if you do a complete search of their database. But they've never discussed scheduling people, businesses involved with alcohol and tobacco. Not to ban those drugs, I'm not talking about prohibition, but just to create that equal playing field so we don't have those divisions and that everything is scientifically neutral. They've never done it. So the Advisory Council has let us down because they're failing to really get to grips with the providing legislation and their duties. And really, if we're going to be progressive, we should be fighting for a very powerful Advisory Council that will work, even though it's not purely a democratic principle. I mean, I do like the idea that governments, supposedly democratically elected bodies, have the power more than judges, so that judges deciding things about society is very elitist and they're not accountable to us. So at least we have this idea of voting, even if it seems ineffectual. So it's better that ministers decide than government. And it's also not a great thing that quangos, like they sort of abdicated responsibility to manage the economy through the Bank of England, and they then made a sort of quango, made them their own expert body outside of the minister's remit. So there's a flip side to this. But nevertheless, under these circumstances, to have a advisory council that's working would be a good idea. And I'm afraid David, no, I'm sorry, I don't mean to stick the knife in him too much, but he did actually argue, and I think this is what got him sacked, as much as the equity, which was horse riding love, say is more dangerous than ecstasy line, which is infamous. And it
was a good paper, worth it. I enjoyed reading it because it was put together with great hilarity in mind, I believe, or feel.
His harm matrix, it published in the Lancet, was superb and groundbreaking. Unfortunately, the sort of the legal context, the understanding of the duties that he had and the powers that he had was lacking, which is why he didn't get any traction with that. because even he believed that actually alcohol and tobacco and things like that are legal drugs outside of the law. But I mean, so I think those kind of fundamental legal myths that he bought into, and he's even after talking to me, I spent hours with him in Leeds, produced a book about drugs without the hot air, the problems of legal and illegal drugs, which really frustrated me that he hadn't got it. But you know, his hands were. He said his hands were tied, but ultimately he said that experts should decide policy, and actually it's an advisory council, and that means to advise ministers. The advisory council never make policy. That is not their role. So I'm kind of just justifying what I'm saying, so as not to sound too non-democratic about things by suggesting that experts have a bigger role, and those experts should include perhaps people of a spiritual disposition and members of the public. So it's not, you know, real drug users and people that have experience of rave culture and things like that should be welcome onto the committee. So it's not a group, a bunch of suits pontificating about something that they really don't know nothing about, quite literally. I mean, you can read all you like, but you'll never know. As we've said before, that the communication that drugs have is on a chemical level, not a linguistic level. So I kind of protect myself from that accusation by introducing members of the public and other people into that, and by saying that it is advice. Ultimately, the minister will decide, although, again, it's free for the courts to question that on human rights grounds or even common law grounds as to whether the minister is acting reasonably. There's this idea of reasonableness in administrative law, which is actually called Wednesbury unreasonableness. And that means that a decision made by a figure in authority should not be so unreasonable that an ordinary citizen would find it unreasonable. So but again, of course, going to court is not actually democratic, but we might need these systems to transcend this impasse in society where everything is so contentious and we're not working together harmoniously and empathically with people with might have drug problems, or they just see benefits in what they do. So an empowered advisory council with an understanding of the core liberty that's at stake, that should be pervasive throughout the administration of this law, would be, always in their contemplation. And indeed, the Misuse of Drugs Act sets out to achieve that in a way. Although people don't believe it and they want to get rid of it, it actually sets out to balance that equation that we talked about earlier between liberty and social harms through those regulations, bearing in mind that use of drugs is not illegal. So it can do all of that, and that's what we should be setting out to do with an advisory council. And that would mean, for our cannabis-focused friends, that would mean that there would be some regulations. We don't need to take it completely outside of the Act. I had a big discussion with a charming group of people from Ireland at the end of Product Earth that are all campaigning to get cannabis removed from the Misuse of Drugs Act. And I said, we don't even need to do that. I mean, apart from the fact that it's the green fetish that I talked about, that it's not really
drug exceptionalism.
Striking the nail on the head. It's a kind of a side issue in some regards. Even if the only drug you ever want to use is cannabis, it's still, as you said, we're all the possibility. Other people are as much in my contemplation as myself in all of this, that we don't need to take cannabis outside the Misuse of Drugs Act. I mean, yes, it would be interesting if they did that, but at the same time, I've got caveats that, call it a plant, call it a drug. I call it a herb. I'm not quite into that semantics. I don't think those things are so important. So that all those language things that you might use the wrong term to describe somebody, you might misgender somebody. And people are very, very clear about this. If I was to stand up in public and use the wrong word, to describe a minority, whatever, people would walk out. But those words of the law, they're very important. They say, because you could say sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And in some ways, calling somebody some slur, some racist slur or homophobic slur, it's not worthy. It's not anything that should be celebrated at all. But ultimately, the harm caused by that is fairly subjective, and robust people might be able to deflect some of that. I'm not saying there isn't an overriding culture that taps into it, because you are getting real oppression and racism and homophobia at the same time. So it's not very nice when people add to that by using the wrong words and saying things which are offensive to you. But in terms of freedom of speech, you can't really balance that with a right not to be offended, because a right of freedom of speech means a freedom from state intervention. That's what real rights are. Real civil rights are not about what the state can do for you, it's what the state won't do. So it gives you an area of operation. So freedom of speech means that you can say virtually what you like. I mean, I know there are caveats to that as well, about official secrets and military secrets and things like that, which are probably best not just churned out in popular media in this society, but not in a future society. But the idea that you have a right not to be offended, that's an open-ended, vacuous concept, which requires the police and Crown Prosecution Service come in and stop you speaking. So it's not really a balance of two equal concepts, the right to speak and the right not to be offended. They're qualitatively very, very, very different. So I'm not quite sure how I got onto that now, but really we can afford reasonable rights to people. Nobody needs to complain unless they are actually directly affected by other people's actions. And that's what the law enables us to do. It enables us to afford people those rights. It does. The Misuse of Drugs Act and our common law and our human rights already recognize the principles that I'm talking about. It's not even controversial in many regards to administer the Misuse of Drugs Act properly. And it naturally will be a harm reduction model, even though I think harm reduction is another sort of sacred cow within the movement, that what we're trying to do is reduce harms. And, I'm entirely on board with that. But really, the more important thing is the fundamental core human right to have bodily autonomy and freedom of thought. It is about thought, because drugs change the modality of thinking. And that is what is so threatening and scary to people, because sometimes it involves like huge transcendental experiences that people imagine are only done by tribal people and primitive people, and they're not for us because they're too uncomfortable. And people are scared of that. They are scared of that. And I think some intrepidation about those kind of things is right and understandable. But when it translates into telling other people what to do, and what's appropriate, these things are rooted in I don't know, the interpretation of Christianity and the interpretation of various philosophers that have got us to where we are, that somehow these are dirty ideas, and drug use is stigmatized because you are transcending God's desire for you to be a certain way, and you're doing something diabolical. And of course, it is actually the opposite. It is actually a spiritual quest. The idea of the psychonaut, the spiritualist, the shaman, is to get as close and to be your best self, to be the purest self. And it's monastic. I mean, it's not the same as taking drugs as purely for pleasure in this regard. There's nothing positive about really fiending on cocaine. It's quite selfish, although I support people's right to do it. But those roots of actually trying to break free from the constraints of religious dogma, Western religious dogma, into something that characterizes different indigenous cultures and has done for thousands of years, their pathways to spirituality, is very, very significant. And they're literally censoring what it means to feel God, to feel connection. They're literally saying, no, we don't want you to have that direct route to feel connectivity. We want you to read these prayers, to sing these songs, to stand up and sit down when we say, which is my experience of going into religious places, is that I don't feel kind of spiritual or religious at all. I've just been told what to do, what page we're on. I've stood there. In my background was Jewish. I've never been really observant about that, or just in phases. But I've gone to a synagogue and I've just been kind of meditating and looking at a beautiful object, something, just thinking about the context of my life and what this is going on. And people have come and poked me and said, look, we're on this page here. This is what you should read. And they want to tell you what to do, whereas really what these molecules represent is a sort of shortcut in a way that perhaps people that study yoga might argue with, that really you should be doing pranayamic breathing, or like Stanislav Grof with his holotropic breath work, and very careful dietary rules and the rest of it, and you will obtain some spiritual level they call samadhi and mindlessness. But we don't always have the time or the possibility of doing that. These things are very, very, very tough challenges. And in many ways, I think a lot of the drugs that are available, the so-called class A drugs, psychedelic drugs, they offer a pathway to a different way of being. And I think that is hardwired into us. I think we naturally enjoy changing our consciousness in much the same way as those kids spinning around do to get dizzy, or people do to get running, that it is intrinsically satisfying and revelatory. And they seem to want to stop that and make it into a process that is, you can go on a meditation retreat, but you can't do it, with a substance. And
it's an attempt at homogenization, standardization. The reason alcohol is allowed to be so ubiquitous is everyone basically has the same experience. You get a slowing, you drink too much, you're going to get sick. A certain percentage have a propensity towards violence. Some people are going to get, sexually active and horny and go off and do whatever. Some people are just going to go, I'm going to put a cone on my head. And they've qualified the outcomes. They've built the pen. They understand how to let the sheep get fucked up on that substance and go out. You can't do that with these other compounds. I've taken LSD, like 1 year, me and my mate did it every Sunday for a year as part of like an integral sort of therapy program we built to kind of help each other out. And every experience was different, entirely different. You can't, and we tried to standardize certain settings to get certain sort of protocols. It was like an unofficial, I guess, social experiment that we were operating under. But the compounds itself doesn't let you do that. The variables within it, have you eaten, what are you stimulated by within the environment? Is there poly drug use involved? Is there et cetera, et cetera? You know what I mean? It's
the genie is out the bottle, though, isn't it?
Yeah. And then we're arriving at a point now where they're fucked either way. They really are. So I think it's vitally important as a community and as a movement, we really hammer down to this language. I think you've touched on a wonderful thing, that we need a citizens drug advisory board made up of civilians, as in people that are not involved or connected with government.
Well, both.
A combination, so that we can have that conversation. Because I know a lot of academics that have done, they're not going to be as open as Dennis was last week when he was saying how much drugs use he's had. I know a lot of academics that study these things that enjoy a lot of different, bouquet of drug use, but they couldn't ever personally say that because their career would be taken despite what they study. So if we could create this space where there are, lived experience, which is a vitally important data set that's missing, plus this academic and a little crossover of their lived experience as well, because that much more informs their work. Again, tattoos don't get. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that drugs are the answer, but maybe it's interesting. I was reading, I think, in an extract of Michael Pollan's book, where he described how societies have relied upon sort of this idea of contrarianship, being a contrarian in society, that those people that took psychedelics were different, in the sense that some leader might say, right, well, we need to walk to new pastures, we're all going to walk west. And some people would be contrarians and say, well, no, we're going to go east. And about 10% of them would. And throughout evolution, invariably, some of the people that decided to go west with the leader, they would not find green pastures and they would die out. And if it wasn't for the contrarians, none of the people would survive. And so this idea of not going with the flow of the education system, the official education system and the official narrative, whilst they're demonized by the courts and viewed entirely cynically, those are the really important people. Yeah, there will be some crazy loons in that bunch that don't actually amount to very much and lead people towards disaster. But those people that step outside of that framework and say, let's do things differently, are very important. And perhaps it's psychedelics that have allowed that kind of conscious reflection over the context. So it allows that stepping back, not being on the shop floor. So like 90% of the people are effectively on the shop floor, and other people have taken this different perspective, and that they have, in a sense, solved the problem. So what I was saying about Casey as an LSD chemist, coming up with an analysis, and he was working with me for a while, and I say he kind of led me to look at it more deeply. In a way, the drugs have actually facilitated a level of understanding and thinking that solves the problem of drug prohibition. And that is really what I'm why I'm here today, is to try and solve drug prohibition, to start a conversation about that people can reference it, or it's just part of a chain. Hopefully, but certainly making some progress. I've been doing this for about 15 years. It is very difficult. I'm beginning to identify, what the barriers to understanding are, and working on better examples. I still haven't cracked it, because for most of that time I've been a lone voice. It was great to hear you to explain that cannabis wasn't illegal. I mean, that is almost a unique event in my experience. I've usually been somebody at conferences. Casey sent me to the World Psychedelic Forum in 2005 in Basel in Switzerland, and when I was trying to introduce these ideas, I'm not exactly being hissed at, but I rolled that, and I still get that, even though there's a lot of truth in these ideas. But there's the right time for everything. It's always now, and it will improve. It will definitely improve, because I recognize that some of these ideas about the importance of language, that it creates, it's not reflective and responsive to a reality that is out there. It actually is creating a reality. And it does it in law to such an extent. Law is language on steroids. It is so much about the words. And to think that, I'm sorry, but I had a lot of discussions with Danny and Steve from Transform, and they were the most reluctant, and Transformers still are. I still see them at events. I see they come out and do stuff, and their blueprint for regulation was pretty useful work, and they have been very high profile in trying to explain the pragmatic benefits of reform, but every group falls short of actually grasping the nettle. Because there's two reasons for reform. One is the pragmatic thing, which is about harm reduction, is about economic cost, and not incarcerating people necessarily. But the other limb of it is we need liberty. Really, liberty is what defines us what it means to be human. But they won't touch that. They won't talk about the positives, really. They only just get into it if there's some little medical benefit for somebody to go, oh, look at that. But they don't say, no, it's positive that with suitable education in the suitable place, that you should have the freedom to choose what you want to do with your mind and body. They won't do that. They won't grasp the nettle. And my experience with Transform was that, I'm still blocked by Transform. I'm blocked by a lot of people on Twitter and they don't let me read their stuff, because they know that if I read it, I'm an expert proofreader now. I've spent so many years on it. I just pick up immediately on all the points of law and the linguistic fallacies within their arguments, and I read it every day. So many cannabis groups talking about it's an illegal drug, we need to legalize it, and all this stuff, and they can't bear it because people don't really like to be told how to speak. It's very personal to us, but yet they are so happy to walk out if somebody uses the wrong word to describe a minority group, but they will nevertheless talk about illegal drugs. And I have to tell you that it is as offensive an expression as you could possibly get, believe it or not. It is truly offensive because what it does, it degrades your citizenship to that of an object like slavery, and it carries the force of law when, although it doesn't exist in law, as I've said before, legal drugs do not exist in law, they administer the law as if they do. That's the thinking behind the way that they operate all those regulations that I told you about in the Misuse of Drugs Act, is that it is illegal. And whenever somebody writes a petition, they'll come back and say, cannabis is an illegal drug because. They always say that. It's illegal because. Every Home Secretary will say it. Priti Patel was particularly unconscionable about that. I think we've got a new Home Secretary now, I can't remember their name, but I'm sorry, but Transform, they stuck to that narrative. They think that the public understand it, and therefore they don't want someone like me muddying the waters, saying, well, actually, it's more complicated than that. Let's stick with our little easy terms, a bit like it's easy just to put an amanita instead of a psilocybin. Don't worry about it. Let's just say that drugs are illegal because people know what that means. But what they know that means is something which is completely incorrect, because it closes the door on all of those regulations that they're entitled to. Because whilst it is like illegal to be caught with cannabis in your possession without the license authority or exemption, yes,
it's unlawful in that sense, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I'm not even going to split the difference on that one at the moment, although I appreciate you raising it. But there is a space to operate where it shouldn't be through those regulations, because you're not causing social harm. And therefore, the fact that you're criminalized, but somebody drinking alcohol isn't, is an inequality of treatment. That's a common law expression, that you should treat like cases alike and different cases differently. So alcohol is a fair analogy for a controlled drug, because it can be misused. It does cause social problems. And yet we're not grasping the nettle. We're not grasping it because we've got this binary thinking about legal or illegal, whereas in fact it's much more nuanced than that. Controlled drugs means drugs that we are controlled with respect to, and the purpose of that control is to ameliorate the social harms that might arise through the misuse of that drug. And all that is irrelevant in the way that it's being administered. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't even matter what the consequences are. In fact, and the other thing is that people always advocate the benefits. And whilst it's good to talk about the benefits, that alpha kid, he's getting benefits from his cannabis, there's no doubt about it. But actually, the Misuse of Drugs Act is not about benefits. We don't have to wave the flag for the benefits. We only have to point to the fact that there's no social harm. It's not there to encourage positive drug use, although it can. The law is there to step in when misuse causes social problems. And if there are no social problems caused by misuse, there's no justification for stopping those activities. You don't need to come along and say, actually, there's a benefit to it. I mean, I'm not saying it's harmful to point to the benefits, but you're arguing about something you don't need to, because it's already a given that you should have access to something if it's neutral. If it doesn't cause harm to society, it's neutral. You don't need to make a case about what you can achieve, because maybe you won't achieve it, and then they'll say, well, you've predicated your argument on the fact that you're going to cure all these people, and you haven't. They've all relapsed. But so what? You don't have to do that. The law is about avoiding negative consequences. Criminal law is about avoiding antisocial behavior. It's not about encouraging positive behavior. You don't even have to be a good Samaritan in law. effect.
Yeah.
Unless you're some qualified lifesaver, you don't have to save somebody from drowning in the river. You don't have to. You're not guilty of murder or even manslaughter by walking on. I mean, you should try to do something if you can. You should definitely try to do something. But the law is not about telling you how to behave positively in that regard. Those are more civil duties. The criminal law is about stopping you harming other people. And if you don't have a duty of care, you don't have to go out and create positive benefits for society. You just have to not harm society. So I'm always focusing back on that individual right to choice, personal autonomy, that is integral to defining what it culturally means, and in this case, biologically means to be human, because those drugs are the most intimate things that we can do. It's more intimate than making love, isn't it, really? Because it's actually completely within you. It's completely taken part of you. And that is a natural and normal phenomena that has been going on for thousands of years. And the stigma that is around it is being created through social constructs and religious dogma, and to preserve the rights of certain classes of people. And now we're seeing that move from the sort of spiritual priestly class of wanting to maintain this sort of hierarchy about who has access to things. It's moving into the corporate sphere, where it's corporations that are now determining what it means to be human, as it were. And none of it gives people or allows us to develop the power as citizens, free subjects, as we are entitled to.
Yeah. No, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, and it's one of the things I've been circling around in my head for a while of where to put my efforts and my energies, and where to kind of sort of direct the efforts of others that are feeling very disenfranchised and kind of lost within all of this. And I think, back to the liberty argument, there's some really good movements around like a consciousness revolution. So obviously people trying to win back our attention from Silicon Valley and from some of like the apps and the other ways that our systems around us that govern us and that rule our daily lives have, kind of, well, to use Johann Hari's phrase, stolen our focus. So I think there is some great intersectionality and connection with other movements. And once we can get people to understand that the drug, it's irrelevant, the expression of the drug use is irrelevant. The right to use it is the argument. I mean, I think of Voltaire, of the quote of speaking of, I may disagree with you, but I'll fight to the death for your right to defend the right for you to say it. Yeah. That's the position that we need to be in as a society. That I probably am not likely, especially with a needle phobia, to ever intravenously use heroin or cocaine or any of those kind of injectable substances. But I'm definitely going to fight to my dying day for the people that do, because there is no difference.
Yeah, you are the possibility of that. That's what you represent.
Exactly that. And they're denying me a choice. Therefore, they're making my world smaller. If you are not, they don't deny you your sexual expression, or they're not supposed to. It's enshrined by law. I know, obviously, we've spoken of the fragility and issues within that. But then the same is true of religious identity. You know what I mean? We now have, obviously, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. They did some brilliant work in Australia where they got their religious headwear, which was an upside down cauldron, on their official identification pictures, and got it obviously accepted in various things. And what they were doing was basically just trying to show that belief is belief is belief. You can't just then say we're going to protect these certain religions because they have this established dogma. If you believe in something, and I think this is the next thing, the next belief structure is that we believe we are free. Not that we have to ask for it. It's that we already were free. They've built this thing on top of us, and almost through consciousness and understanding these systems and just deconstructing them. Once we understand their language and we talk about it all ourselves, we can see how weak it is, how bastardized it's become through the misinterpretation of consecutive generations of governments, people in positions of authority and power, and of supposed independent advisors that have constructed this reality. I'm very mindful of the time here, of the length of this.
I'll just say though that you're right to say that about the language, because before I didn't quite finish that. I remembered now that I said sticks and stones would break my bones, and I was talking about offensive language, and then I come back to that illegal drugs thing. Is that law, although it's words, it is like sticks and stones, because yes, they will use words to beat you up, as it were, to lock you up, to take your liberty, to search your belongings, and all those things. So words, really do carry power. And I think the key to unraveling this, it does, as soon as it takes some time to realize it, and don't expect people necessarily to get this straight away. But as soon as you dispel that illegal drugs myth, you open up everything. In fact, it is the key, the portal through we have to go, because then we connect all the dots after that. Everything falls into place as soon as you realize that the state doesn't control objects, and they can't have this like edifice of legality and illegality about objects. Is that all of your rights come into play? They're actually up now in the equation. They're on the table, and ultimately separating these ideas out, which it brings it all together. So it's almost like that experience of connectivity that ultimately is the chemical message from the drug experience itself, is born out from the realization. It brings everything together. It brings together the materialists and the metaphysicists. Ultimately, it does. I don't expect people to quite get that just now, but ultimately, all of these conundrums and divisions within the drug policy reform movements, that you have all of the sort of eclectic spiritual people that turn up, ex-hippies and whatever, at these events, and you've got all these doctors and psychiatrists and controllers, and they're coming from two different angles, where it's going to be compass pathways controlling this, or it's going to be people. Ultimately, it all comes together once you understand the language paradigm. And I know that is a difficult thing to see straight away. It took me months, literally, or years. I realized the profundity of what Casey came up with, and what I have been talking about 15 years. It is more profound than it appears on the surface. It's definitely not just a legal exercise, a semantic exercise. It is something which is philosophical and actually gets to the core of this self and other, that ultimately we are connected, and that we are part of this huge sort of matrix of molecules, and it's all part of our inheritance and our futures. As a freedom of choice of the individual, we support the individual in order to connect the individual, so that the society is the important entity at the end of the day, not just the individual. But we have to fight for the individual now to make him part of the society, to make him connected to all of these things, or her. So it's they or it. I don't worry about minor language transgressions of what's PC and what isn't. I'm saying that this particular language protocol is something which carries real weight, because it carries the force of law ultimately, because the law is being used as if these concepts, these constructs are real, and they're not real. They're fake. They're based upon misuse of language. And as soon as we start to use the language properly, we will see how that puts us back at the center of our lives, and makes us the possibility of being, that whether you choose it or not, we have those possibilities. Without those possibilities, we are lab rats in a petri, or like we're in a petri dish, and somebody's introducing molecules and saying, well, you can have that, and see what effect it has on those bacteria. We're almost that. But sorry, we're out of time, but we've probably done a good chunk.
Thinking, we were basically approaching, I think, 3 hours on that, which is
it? Wow.
Yeah, pretty good. I think there's a hell of a lot in there for people to digest. I'm going to obviously share some links below for people to learn more about Casey and his story, and the work that you sort of have been undertaking. I just want to, I suppose, final question: where can people find more of your work, or more information about what it is here? Because I think this is hopefully going to, ignite a few fires in a few people to go, holy shit, and then get that itch, and really they need somewhere to go scratch it. So have you got anywhere to direct them?
Well, I don't mind if people contact me, if they can. In fact, it's actually the hardest question you've asked, because this week the guy who was administering the website that we had has disappeared, and decided he's not doing it, and it's gone offline. So I'm sorry to sort of end on a disappointing note there, but I'm happy to, if you want to put a contact address on your blog, I won't say it now, but I'll an email. I'm happy to point people at stuff that's still up and online. So that, unfortunately, Drug Quality Alliance website is offline, but I'm not quite sure quite what to do with it, because I actually struggle with IT. If anybody wants to volunteer to help with IT, we could possibly get it back online. There will be stuff that I've done previously. I never look back at what we did previously and think that was great, because it's always like evolving, and I'm more happy with this conversation than any other podcast. And then I knew you'd be great, because out of all the people at the cannabis focus thing, I could see that you'd stood back and you looked at it from above, and you were open to this, and that's why we've had a really good conversation. But people could Google my name and see some talks I've done at Breaking Convention, things like that. But I can't say I'm terribly proud of it. But just focus on the ideas that I've got. I'll leave an email address for you on the website. Anybody can contact me, and I'm happy to talk about it, explain things to people. I've always done that. I'm not too busy for that. I'm not famous, like I can't deal with it. So it's my pleasure to help people get this right. And if people, I'm certain that all the legal things that I've said are correct. Some things are a matter of opinion. Obviously, I've gone into a little bit of conjecture about the importance of molecules, and that's based upon my own thought. But a lot of what I've said is pretty rigorous, and if people want to check it out, then check it out. And if you don't quite get it yet, because that's what will happen, people will say, hang on a second, I've been talking about this for a long time. You don't just hear something and then fundamentally transform yourself. You need a 3-day workshop to do that.
You need that integration period, whether it's learning something on psychedelics or hearing something on a podcast.
Yeah. I don't want to sound arrogant about it, but I know it's right. I know the legal side is right. So it's what people make of it is entirely up to them. But this is the way forward is to refute this idea. And when any politicians and other things start talking about illegal drugs, is don't let them, because what they're doing is they're shutting you off. They're literally calling you a slave, that you have no possibilities of being in this regard, that they're going to control your consciousness completely, irrespective of outcomes. And that your agency doesn't matter, because what they've given it to drugs, they actually gave the legal agency that you enjoy, that is a common law principle, that everything should allow you reasonable freedom to operate until you reach that threshold. They've completely taken that away. They've completely taken it away. And they're doing that through that language, through that simple idea, because there is no equivalence between an illegal drug and controlling people with respect to dangerous drugs. They're very, very different ideas. And if we actually use the law properly, it is our friend. It is, I'm not a complete anarchist. I'm not saying, let's do away with law, even though there's lots of problems. That's for a future world. At the moment, the real law is rational, but the way that they're administering it is based upon entirely false constructs. It's false consciousness that's pervading the reform movement. And I say to everybody that's involved with cannabis campaigning and everything, it's almost like a religious pursuit. I'm not against what you're doing, and I'm not even suggesting that you need to try every other drug on the planet in order to get a different perspective. I'm just saying that you are focusing on the object, not the subject. You're focusing on a thing rather than what it represents. And it represents something else. What's being represented is a freedom to be in any way that you choose. That is possible. And we have to. It's not about legalizing all drugs. It's about regulating people sensibly with respect to all drugs. And it has to happen. That's the principle that has to go forward. It's not, no matter what you achieve with cannabis, and of course, people have achieved things with cannabis, the legalization movement in America and other places, they've got more rights to do one thing, but it's not really opening that many doorways. It's creating as many regulations as even more regulations were before. It's inviting an awful lot of business and corporations into something which is essentially a spiritual practice. We need to pull back and recognize what is the message of that we can gain from these drugs. I mean, the mycelium of fungi is something which is all embracing. It crosses the continents. It's there as our inheritance. It's there as a communicator for thousands of years. It's not the property of a corporation that uses Amanita emojis to promote it. It just isn't.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll be up 4 hours.
I was going to say, I'm trying desperately not to respond to you, because otherwise we're going to go off.
No, it's meant to be a summing up. So
yeah,
I really enjoyed speaking with you. I know I've been a bit gone off on a long rant every now and again, but it's really lovely. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, honestly. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. It's helped solidify some more of these conceptual ideas within my consciousness, and hopefully, like I said, it'll help a lot more of my audience as well. Try and even just become itchy, as it were, to use a terrible analogy, that there's something wrong here. If you could feel that discomfort, lean into it, folks, please, because that's where we're going to find truth. That's where we're going to be able to, I was going to say congeal, that's a terrible image in my brain there, to incorporate in a certain way together in a collective movement. And the image that flashed before my head earlier, when we were talking, was a crack pipe on a yellowed background thing, like the Americans libertarian movement, with the snake, don't tread on me. And it was just in my head, we need to embrace that. It's the idea of the hypodermic needle, of the thing of these, again, empty totems that they have then put in this meaning that we then pick up and go, although your meaning, as you said, robbed us of agency, of autonomy, of sovereignty, of so many different things. But the fight back starts today, folks, when you realize that they're not illegal. They're criminalizing you, not just you, whether you choose to or not. You are a criminal under their eyes. All of us are, actually, the way the drugs laws work effectively. That's quite a fair way of looking at it, actually. That the assumption is that you will always and only capable of doing bad things with that drug. Therefore, we can't trust you with drugs.
Very good.
It is an insanity. But yeah, definitely going to have you back on again in the not too distant future, brother, because there's so much more I want to delve into here. But like I said, I think my listeners' ears needed a little bit of a rest.
Yeah. Lovely. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. I'll let you log off now, and then I'll do my housekeeping.
All the best. And do take my details for your audience. If they want to contact me, I really don't mind.
Beautiful. I'll make sure to contact you later on tonight, tomorrow, as I'm doing the bio, and we'll make sure we've got all the right words.
Lovely.
But it's been a pleasure, honestly, brother. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, there you go, folks. That was Darryl Bickler. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you guys did too. A lot to cover. I know it's been about 3 hours we've just had that conversation. I did mention at the start, obviously, it may take a couple. I didn't expect it to take 3, but actually we could have gone on for many more. I do hope that you found the information that we provided within this useful. We do have many of the links below as well if you want to keep up and understand what's happening with Casey's story. Last I looked, actually, I believe that he was putting in a bid to run for the US president in 2024. Bit different. I'll try and find the link and pop that in the description below, so do check that one out. But yeah, I hope we've kind of covered the nuance of this. We've kind of touched on, well, I say touched on, we've very deep dove into sort of the nuance of the legalese here, and the difference between legal and lawful, and to try and understand that it is us we are the ones that are criminalized here, that it is our actions, it is what we do with the substances that is criminalized. And yeah, it all comes down to ultimately liberty, freedom. And I am now more than ever sure of the idea and the concept that legalization is not the freedom and liberty that we are seeking. It is, as Darryl spoke of, it is a Trojan horse. It is a linguistical, cognitive trick to get us to believe in a paradigm. They've worn us down over decades with this war to now believe in their paradigm, as I spoke of earlier, that they should be in charge of this after they've spent decades demonizing us for doing it. I think is personally repugnant, repulsive, and yeah, I cannot support this at this point. I am really struggling here, quite literally in this moment as my brain is mulling through this, because even the constructs that I have spoken of deschedulization, especially now having spoke with Darryl, I now need to go away and further read, especially points 22, articles 22, 7, and 31 of the Misuse of Drugs Act. I need to deep dive further into this to understand the potential benefits of this. I potentially have been operating through a muddied lens here to some degree, and as always, I'm happy to take you guys on this journey with me. So watch this space. I don't know what's coming next. Yeah, if you've enjoyed this episode, folks, please do check us out on patreon.com, where for less than a cup of coffee a week, you can help me keep the lights on this little project of mine. We'll be back next week with Mendo Dope Boys. That's going to be bad, man. Do check it out. Yeah, like, share, subscribe, all that good shit. See you next week. Peace and love, folks.